Chapter 2243. At this moment, a strange change suddenly shrouded the entire fourth level of the Tao Master's path. All the time attribute was completely frozen at this moment. Whether it was the time attribute contained in the power of creation, the time attribute of the Tao Master's prison, or even Luo Fan's own time attribute, all of them had completely frozen. What's this? At this moment, Luo Fan, who was aware of this change through his own concept of existence, suddenly felt a jolt in his heart. At this time, his concept of existence probed the reality level with the help of the connection between the levels. In an instant, he found that the entire reality level had completely frozen. It was as if time had suddenly stopped, and everything that should have changed under the flow of time had completely stopped at that moment. Senior Sister May, who had been forcibly pulled into the Tao Master's prison by the power of the Tao Master's prison, was frozen there in a state where she was about to completely disappear. Even the power of the Tao Master's prison seemed to have suddenly turned into a substance and mixed with the endless power of creation. Luo Fan's body in the reality level did not feel anything at all and maintained an inexplicable expression. Sensing slightly with his concept of existence, he knew that his self in the reality level was now completely without any thoughts. All of his thoughts, and even all of his thoughts were maintained at the moment when time stopped. At this moment, a faintly discernible figure gradually emerged from the stagnation. This figure looked like a middle-aged man with a sallow complexion. He was dressed in a gray robe, and his eyes were cloudy. He looked like an ordinary middle-aged man who would appear at any time on the streets of a small secular city. However, at this time, Luo Fan did not dare to regard him as an ordinary person at all. An ordinary person could never appear on the fourth level of the Tao Master's path. Moreover, it was even more impossible for him to move freely when the time attribute of the entire fourth level of the Tao Master's path had completely stopped. Just from the way he appeared, it was enough to see that the strength and realm of this middle-aged man with a sallow complexion had at least surpassed Luo Fan's. Who would have thought that in just a few trillion years, the fourth level would have fallen to such a state? The middle-aged man sighed. As he spoke, he casually pointed with his hand, and Senior Sister May, who had almost completely disappeared, began to solidify again. Not long after, she had completely returned to her original appearance. However, even so, Senior Sister May still didn't feel or move at this moment. She was still in a state where time was completely frozen. She was no different from Luo Fan. They were no different from the countless living beings in the world clusters. The waxen, middle-aged man looked at her with a frown. With a wave of his hand, the power of the endless Tao Master's prison in the surroundings completely disappeared, as if it had never appeared. Seeing this, Luo Fan was extremely shocked. One should know that this was the power of the Tao Master's purgatory. It was a kind of power that targeted almost all cultivators and all existences on the road to becoming a Tao Master. This kind of power was almost unique to all cultivators. Any cultivator in front of it should be unable to resist it. How could it be easily brushed away by the waxen middle-aged man, as if he was manipulating plasticine? What is this person's realm? At this moment, such a doubt appeared in his mind. With a slight thought, his corresponding existences on each level began to look around for the waxen middle-aged man's corresponding existences on each level in reality. Although his ability to control his corresponding existences on each level was not as good as his ability to control his own body in reality. However, it had reached a level that ordinary cultivators could not imagine. To him, searching for the existence of a certain object on various levels was almost as easy as searching for an object on the table in front of him. Very quickly, he had already locked his perception onto the strange existences that existed on various levels. It's actually this way of existence. Looking at the strange existences, Luo Fan was inexplicably shocked. Although the waxen middle-aged man couldn't do what Luo Fan did and perfectly control his existence in the other layers, he had used another method to protect his existence in the other layers. For example, on the conceptual level, the waxen middle-aged man's corresponding existences did exist. However, at this moment, the concept of existence that he corresponded to was restrained to the extreme. It looked incomparably small, and it even gave off a faintly discernible feeling. When one slightly manipulated other existences to come into contact with him, one would find that almost all contact with the waxen middle-aged man's existence was difficult. Only a very small number of existences that contained a strong will could really touch the waxen middle-aged man's existence. This was not only on the conceptual level, but also on the corresponding existences on other levels. Almost on every level, the waxen middle-aged man's existence was extremely difficult to touch and restrained to an extremely small state. If it weren't for Luo Fan's well-being strong enough, and his ability to control the existences corresponding to each level was beyond imagination, perhaps even he wouldn't be able to touch the various existences corresponding to each level. At this moment, the waxen middle-aged man seemed to have sensed something. His expression shook, and he suddenly looked at Luo Fan, who had been frozen in time in the real world. The turbidity in his eyes instantly disappeared and turned into an unimaginable profundity that seemed to contain endless mysteries of a world. Everything that was illuminated by his eyes seemed to be exposed to him in an instant. After a long time, he could not see anything, and his brows furrowed even deeper. Could it be an illusion? He muttered. As he muttered, he retracted his gaze. Just at the moment when Luo Fan thought that he was not going to take any action, the waxen middle-aged man suddenly raised his hand and slapped toward Luo Fan. This slap was extremely hasty and carried infinite power. It felt as if all the power, all the changes, and all the power in the fourth level of the Town Master's Road were instantly condensed in his palm, and he sent it straight toward Luo Fan at this moment. In this state of stagnation of time, the only one who could move was him. In other words, the only one who had the time attribute and could still describe it as experiencing time was him. Under such circumstances, his slap naturally came to Luo Fan at a speed that surpassed everything. Only to hear, in an instant, an earth-shattering shock began to spread from where Luo Fan was standing in all directions. Even the surrounding time attribute, which had been completely frozen by some incomparably powerful power, began to flow again. Earth-shattering movements continued to emerge, and the endless creation power in the surroundings was pushing, leaving an increasingly large vacuum around Luo Fan's body. In other words, around the area where Luo Fan originally existed. Because, at this moment, under the violent explosion of power, Luo Fan's body in the real world had completely collapsed, and not even a single fragment remained. Everything had been completely devoured by the creation power. It's not him. Seeing this scene, the waxen middle-aged man said doubtfully. Obviously, he was not sure that the wrong morality he sensed was from Luo Fan. However, just because of this suspicion, he had already brazenly attacked and directly erased Luo Fan to prove his speculation. Seeing that Luo Fan had turned into ashes, the waxen middle-aged man shook his head and put it down. Then, with a wave of his hand, the time attribute on Senior Sister May's body, which was frozen not far from him, began to break free from its shackles and move again. As the time attribute regained its agility, the frozen and lifeless feeling on Senior Sister May's body naturally disappeared without a trace. What replaced it was a kind of agility that was far more powerful than before. I also checked a little more. Looking at Senior Sister May, who had become more agile, but had not fully recovered, the waxen middle-aged man muttered. Then, with a wave of his hand, balls of light that seemed to be alive appeared out of thin air and began to gather towards Senior Sister May. In the blink of an eye, they merged with Senior Sister May and disappeared. As more and more light merged with her, the agility on Senior Sister May's body became stronger and stronger. Finally, at a certain moment, when the last ball of light merged with her body, Senior Sister May's eyes moved slightly, and her originally lifeless eyes began to regain their agility. The waxen middle-aged man's appearance was imprinted into her eyes. The moment she saw the waxen middle-aged man, an indescribable look of joy appeared on Senior Sister May's face. She bowed and said, "Thank you, senior brother, for saving my life. No need to be so polite. Fortunately, I'm on the 5th floor, or else no one would have been able to understand the distress signal you sent out. What exactly happened this time? How did you end up like this?" The waxen middle-aged man helped Senior Sister May up as he spoke. Hearing this, Senior Sister May's face became slightly red. She said, "It's a long story. I hope senior brother can deal with the culprit first. If he stays for even a moment longer, there will be more variables." "Culprit? Are you talking about the wandering cultivator who was here just now?" The waxen middle-aged man asked. At this moment, Senior Sister May began to pay attention to her surroundings. When she saw the completely frozen state around her, a strong sense of admiration flashed through her eyes. She then looked at where Luo Fan was and found that there was nothing there. There was no longer any trace of Luo Fan. Only then did she let out a sigh of relief. Just as she was about to say something, she suddenly thought of something and quickly asked, "Senior brother, did you encounter any resistance when you dealt with him just now?" "Resistance?" The waxen middle-aged man revealed a look of disdain. "You overestimate him. Although this person has some methods, he is only a wandering cultivator. How could he have the power to resist me? Not good. I hope senior brother can use your own detection methods to carefully investigate again. Although this person is not strong, his methods are really strange. Not only does he have a powerful defensive method, he also has some unknown method of resurrection. No matter how thoroughly he is destroyed, he can recover in an instant. Since he was killed without even struggling, there must be a trap." Senior Sister May said anxiously. From the moment she first met Luo Fan, the deepest impression that Luo Fan had left on her was his repeated deaths and rebirths. This kind of resurrection surpassed any resurrection from death that she had seen before. It also surpassed all resurrections from death that she had imagined. It felt as if he completely rejected the concept of death. No matter what method he used, no matter how thoroughly he destroyed it, it was just a change in his state. As long as he wanted to, he could reverse it at any time and get rid of the state of death once again. Because of this, although she did not see how the waxen middle-aged man dealt with Luo Fan, she instinctively felt that this person, who had not seen Luo Fan's resurrection from death, would not be able to kill him. Hearing Senior Sister May's words, the waxen middle-aged man frowned. "There is already a shadow in your heart. If you don't get rid of this shadow, I'm afraid that it will be detrimental to your future growth. You will need to work on this in your future cultivation." These words clearly showed that he did not feel that Senior Sister May's worries were meaningless. He was extremely certain that he had already dealt with Luo Fan. Hearing this, Senior Sister May became even more anxious. Every time she dealt with Luo Fan, she felt as certain as this waxen middle-aged man. The waxen middle-aged man's confident state made her unconsciously remember the feeling she had after she dealt with Luo Fan. The feeling that Luo Fan had not died and was still using some method to resurrect became even stronger. "Don't be conflicted. The method I used is not something you can understand right now. The most important thing for you right now is to get rid of the shadow in your heart. Otherwise, I'm afraid that you will never be able to understand the method I used." The waxen middle-aged man saw that Senior Sister May was still unrelenting and sighed in disappointment. Hearing this, Senior Sister May was stunned. For a moment, she did not know what to say to make the waxen middle-aged man listen to her. Chapter 2244. The waxen middle-aged man looked at Senior Sister May with pity in his eyes. The existence of psychological trauma had different effects on different existences. The more powerful a being was, the more troublesome it would be to have a psychological trauma. For example, if an ordinary person had a psychological trauma, all they needed to do was find a psychiatrist and it might be resolved. Moreover, if the trauma wasn't too great, they might be able to think it through after some stimulation, and they might not even need to find a psychiatrist to resolve it. However, if it wasn't an ordinary person who had a psychological trauma, but a cultivator with cultivation, the situation would be different. Even if it was a cultivator who had yet to become an immortal, having a psychological trauma might lead to chi deviation. It would cause many years of cultivation to be destroyed, and it might even have a huge impact on others. As for cultivators who had become immortals, the impact would be much stronger than those who had yet to become immortals. If the trauma was too great, it might even turn into a demon, obtaining a form that was somewhere between tangible and intangible. It would break away from the cultivator and wreak havoc in the world. On the other hand, if a connate grand heavenly realm cultivator were to develop a shadow in their heart, the shadow might transform into a space that was in between reality and illusion at some point in time. The influence of this was countless times greater than the shadow, transforming into a demon. Further up, there were demi-saints, false saints, despairing emperors, tribulation cultivators, and so on. The more powerful a being was, the more terrifying the psychological trauma would be. For a tribulation cultivator who had reached Senior Sister May's level, if the psychological trauma lingered, it was almost certain that a psychological trauma would be born. And the first target of such a psychological trauma would not be anyone else, but Senior Sister May herself. In other words, if Senior Sister May Jujio could see through this psychological shadow, who knew when she would be pulled into that psychological shadow world while she was cultivating? She would turn into all kinds of strange existences and suffer endless torment. It went without saying that this would have a huge impact on her cultivation. It was precisely because of this that the waxen middle-aged man felt so regretful. After all, he had always felt that Senior Sister May's comprehension ability was enough for her to reach his level faster than him. Now that there was this hidden danger, it had almost completely cut off all possibilities for her to reach this level. How could he not feel that it was a pity? You must pay attention to this shadow. Don't wait until it's too big in the future to deal with it. If you do that, it'll be too late. After a long time, the waxen middle-aged man advised. Senior Sister May opened her mouth and wanted to say something, but she was unable to say anything. Her expression was filled with helplessness. Forget it. You can say whatever you want. In any case, you will know who is right in a while. After a long while, she sighed and gave up on explaining. As for why she was so sure that the waxen middle-aged man would know that she was right, the reason was very simple. She believed that with Luo Fan's style of doing things, it was absolutely impossible for him to allow this expert who had killed him once to leave the 4th level so easily. Whether it was to investigate the means of this expert or to take revenge for the danger of being killed once, he would definitely not do nothing. Her words made the waxen middle-aged man even more certain that her psychological shadow was quite stubborn. Immediately, the pity in his eyes became even more intense. Let's go. Although the Tao Master's prison has been blocked by me, it can't last long. We should leave this level as soon as possible. The waxen middle-aged man said after feeling that it was a pity. Senior Sister May naturally nodded indifferently. Whether she agreed or not, the result would be the same. Luo Fan would definitely make his move, and it would be impossible for them to leave so easily. If she didn't agree, she would need to explain why she didn't agree and what her plans were. In contrast, agreeing would not affect the result of the matter, but it would save him a lot of trouble. So why not? The waxen middle-aged man raised his hand and grabbed towards Senior Sister May. In an instant, an indescribable wave enveloped her, causing her to seem to be gradually separated from the 4th level. It was as if she had become an independent and complete individual. I thought you would repair the barrier first. It seems like you are still unable to do that with your strength. At this moment, a voice was transmitted into the ears of the waxen middle-aged man and Senior Sister May. Hearing this, the two of them had completely different expressions on their faces. The waxen middle-aged man's face suddenly became extremely ugly, as if something unbelievable had happened in front of him. Senior Sister May was nervous and happy at the same time. It was as if the thing that she had been anticipating and guarding against had finally happened. At this moment, Luo Fan's figure slowly appeared in front of the two of them. An indescribable wave instantly swept over them, instantly breaking the wave that connected the two of them. The waxen middle-aged man and senior sister May no longer had any connection, and the two of them became independent once again. "How can you still have time?" the waxen middle-aged man asked solemnly. Although he was extremely surprised at how Luo Fan had been resurrected, he was even more surprised that Luo Fan could still move at this time. After all, he had completely frozen all the time attribute in the fourth level of the Tao Master's path. The effect of this stagnation was so strong that even the power of the Tao Master's prison could not escape. He could only obediently release senior sister May from the state where she had almost been thrown into the Tao Master's prison. Even an existence at the same level as him would not be able to easily escape from such a powerful stagnation method if they were unprepared. Under such circumstances, how could the existence in front of him, who was clearly several levels lower than him, completely ignore his stagnation method? Is it strange for an existence at my level to create my own time? Luo Fan shrugged and said indifferently. At this moment, his time attribute was completely isolated from the outside world. In other words, he had once again cut off the connection between his space-time dimension and the space-time dimension of the outside world, so that his own space-time dimension would no longer be affected by any force or power from the outside world. Only in this way could he still move freely when the time attribute of the outside world was completely frozen, as if he was not affected at all. It's not strange to create my own time. However, even if it's my own time, it should be under my control, the waxen middle-aged man said coldly. At this time, he understood that he had misunderstood senior sister May. Perhaps senior sister May did not have any psychological trauma, and everything was just his own wild speculation. This person is extremely strange. It seems that he can comprehend a method after seeing it once. At first, his method was extremely crude, and he was not even a match for me. But now, after I attacked him several times, he almost left me at my wit's end. Senior sister May said solemnly. Hearing this, the waxen middle-aged man frowned and said, "That should be because his level is about the same as yours, and he actually has the power that you have." The reason why he was crude at the beginning was because he did not have enough experience and could not unleash all his power. After seeing your method, he realized that his power could be used like that, so he was able to comprehend it so quickly. What he meant was that he did not think that his method could be comprehended by Luo Fan. At this time, Luo Fan looked at the waxen, middle-aged man in front of him with a calm expression. Thoughts flashed in his mind, and countless ideas flashed in his mind. This waxen middle-aged man was many times stronger than senior sister May. Moreover, there was a mystery hidden in him that senior sister May did not have. It was a profound mystery of a higher level, more powerful, and more wondrous uses. Hearing what the waxen middle-aged man said, senior sister May nodded, and a look of understanding appeared in her eyes. Obviously, she believed in the waxen middle-aged man's judgment. In fact, within the scope of her understanding, it seemed that only the waxen middle-aged man's judgment could explain Luo Fan's strange improvement speed. That's great. This person's thinking is extremely dangerous. If we don't get rid of him, I'm afraid that he will leave a huge hidden danger for our position in the Tao Master's sect in the future. I hope that senior brother can completely get rid of him. Hearing what senior sister May said, the waxen middle-aged man frowned. Originally, he did not have any intention to get rid of Luo Fan. After all, he thought that Luo Fan was just an ant to him. If he helped senior sister May, he would already be suspected of bullying the weak. If he still insisted on getting rid of Luo Fan, it was obvious that he had a part in it. The reason why he attacked Luo Fan previously was because he felt a strange feeling of being spied on from Luo Fan. It was as if Luo Fan, whose time attribute had been stagnated, still had perfect thoughts to spy on him. However, now that senior sister May had said that Luo Fan could become a hidden danger for the Tao Master's position, he had no choice but to take it seriously and think about how to deal with Luo Fan. As Luo Fan listened to their conversation, A faint smile appeared on his face as he said, "Come on, let me see what you're capable of." Senior sister May seemed to see his expression when he was about to face a strong enemy. Senior sister May seemed to see his expression when he was facing her. She also thought of the strange way he would die and come back to life and then die again. She could not help but have an ominous premonition. Obviously, the waxen middle-aged man did not feel the same way Senior Sister May did. At this time, he just sneered. Then, without any nonsense, he raised his hand and pointed at Luo Fan. In an instant, the entire Tao Master's path suddenly began to shrink, crushing toward where Luo Fan was. This crushing contained all the power of the fourth level of the Tao Master's path. The power was so strong that even a part of the world would be completely crushed and turned into nothingness in an instant. Such a terrifying power directly acted on Luo Fan's body at this time, making him feel that his body was directly crushed by that terrifying power at this moment. As his body was crushed, his power, his life essence, and even his spirit were simultaneously subjected to the boundless, terrifying power. They followed in the footsteps of his body and were also crushed to pieces by the power. The entire process was as straightforward as an egg being smashed by an iron hammer. At this time, the existences corresponding to Luo Fan on other levels could not help but exclaim in unison, "Good move." Just now, the waxen middle-aged man's move seemed incredible and seemed to leave no trace. However, with his senses, he was able to clearly see the nature of the attack the moment it arrived. It was the waxen middle-aged man who had instantly created a different time attribute between where he was and the outside world. Because of the difference between the two time attributes, the balance mechanism of the fourth level of the Tao Master's path naturally needed to balance them, thus causing a subtle conflict between them. The emergence of this conflict gave the waxen middle-aged man an opportunity. Under his further adjustment, this conflict produced an unimaginable power that directly acted on his body in the real world. In the end, his body was completely crushed like an egg. This supreme power, created with the help of the subtle changes in the time attribute, did not contain any new mysteries. It was just a special use of the power that he had displayed before to freeze the time attribute of the entire fourth level of the Tao Master's path. However, just the way of thinking behind this special use had already given Luo Fan a considerable revelation, allowing him to comprehend many new mysteries in a trance. He even felt that there seemed to be a lot more room for him to excavate the many mysteries that he had previously thought had been explored to the end. After easily crushing Luo Fan, there was no joy on the waxen middle-aged man's face. This kind of victory was too easy. With the strength shown by the individual cultivator, it was impossible for him to be defeated so easily. He must have new tricks that he had not shown yet. Or in other words, he could definitely be resurrected again. How on earth did he resurrect? Come on, let me have a look. This time, I must see your resurrection method clearly. Such a thought flashed through the waxen middle-aged man's mind. Hurry up and destroy his world cluster. Without the world group, his strength will be greatly reduced. Senior Sister May said hurriedly. Hearing this, the waxen middle-aged man just frowned, but did not take any action. What he wanted now was to explore Luo Fan's resurrection method, not to destroy Luo Fan. If the world group was destroyed and Luo Fan died, wouldn't he suffer a great loss? Seeing that the waxen middle-aged man did not move, Senior Sister May became anxious. Chapter 2245. The waxen middle-aged man looked quite serious. He released his perception and carefully sensed everything around him, looking for any changes that were beyond his imagination. If I can get this resurrection method, I don't need to stay in this lower level anymore. This was what he thought at this moment. As a higher existence on the Tao Master's path, the lower level to him was like a kindergarten to a college student. Unless he became a teacher, otherwise, how bad would he have to be to bully children in kindergarten for fun? From this, it could be seen that this waxen middle-aged man was obviously not doing well in the higher level. At least, it was not good enough for him to stay on the Tao Master's path at the higher level. Under such circumstances, the waxen middle-aged man was naturally very eager to strengthen his ability to survive in the higher level. In fact, he might not really have absolute confidence that he could defeat Luo Fan, but he thought that compared to defeating Luo Fan, it was more important to see his means and gain something from his means. Even if Luo Fan had probably completely defeated the disciples of the Tao Master on the 4th level, even if Luo Fan's thoughts were very likely to shake the status of the Tao Master, it was not as important as gaining something from Luo Fan. It was precisely because of this that he would rather wait for Luo Fan to display his means and for Luo Fan to counterattack more fiercely than before. Because his focus was on this aspect, at this moment, he did not pay any attention to Senior Sister May, who was struggling, resisting, and trying hard to correct his mistake, let alone let her out. Just as the waxen middle-aged man was doing his best to pay attention to the surroundings, suddenly, a figure appeared in front of him with an inexplicable smile on his face. The entire process of his appearance was so abrupt and strange. It felt as if he had been there since the beginning of time, but no one had discovered him all this time. Even the waxen middle-aged man didn't notice the process of its appearance at all. He didn't notice the mysterious and extremely strange changes that occurred during the process of its appearance. In other words, he didn't get what he wanted at all, which was to see the secret of Luo Fan's resurrection. How is this possible? At this moment, the waxen middle-aged man's eyes were filled with shock. After all, even if he was not doing well in the 6th level, he was still an expert who was 2 levels higher than Luo Fan on the road of Tao Master. Such a gap was enough for Luo Fan to have no secrets in front of him, and Luo Fan could not understand his existence at all. However, even with such a huge difference, Luo Fan had resurrected right in front of him without any concealment. He could not understand the principle behind it at all, and could not tell what kind of mysteries Luo Fan had used at all. This instantly caused him to recall the setbacks he experienced on the 6th level, and it caused his aura to become slightly unstable. At this moment, Senior Sister May had an extremely helpless look in her eyes. I told you long ago. Such a thought flashed through her mind. Of course, it was just a thought that flashed through her mind. She naturally wouldn't do something so stupid as offending the waxen middle-aged man and giving him an excuse to vent his anger on her. At this time, Luo Fan grabbed at the surroundings, and a wisp of creation power was already in his hand, as if it was a physical object. With a thought, he patted it, and the wisp of creation power instantly broke free from its stagnant state. It directly regained its original vitality and began to jump wildly in his hand. This was him reactivating the time attribute of the creation power, so that the creation power was free from the waxen middle-aged man's control and regained its freedom. In the face of Luo Fan's means, the waxen middle-aged man's expression became increasingly ugly. Then his expression changed slightly, and he said, "If the first time doesn't work, then 100 times, 1,000 times, 10,000 times." As he spoke, he began to control the time attribute of the entire 4th level, distorting the original balance, and causing the entire 4th level to produce an indescribable crushing force that crushed towards Luo Fan from all directions. Just as the terrifying crushing force was about to crush Luo Fan's body, the boundless creation power around him suddenly moved and directly circled around him, instantly blocking the crushing force. The crushing power was so great that even with the obstruction of the Genesis energy, there was still an extremely astonishing power that was transmitted to Luo Fan's body. The force instantly crushed Luo Fan's body into pieces. He seemed to have exploded at this moment, and he turned into minced meat, dust, and powder. However, at this moment, at the place where Luo Fan exploded, Luo Fan's origin of life was completely undamaged, and it instantly started to regenerate everything that had been crushed. His body and strength were instantly restored, as if nothing had happened. It was because the creation power had blocked the time attribute of the entire 4th level, and the crushing force caused by the imbalance in the time attribute of the entire 4th level was finally disrupted, and the power that the waxen middle-aged man had strengthened could no longer be unleashed perfectly. As a result, this power could no longer break Luo Fan's world of the laws. Since it couldn't shatter this world of the laws, it naturally couldn't destroy his origin of life. With Luo Fan's current level, his origin of life was completely undamaged, and it was only a matter of a thought for him to perfectly recover. Naturally, it was extremely easy for him. That was why this situation had occurred at this moment. Faced with such a change, the waxen middle-aged man's eyes were filled with surprise. Going against the flow? There's actually someone who can go against the flow to this level? Luo Fan didn't know how many times he had heard it, but at this time, the same bewildered voice reached his ears. Evidently, the waxen middle-aged man had seen the world of the laws formed by Luo Fan's origin of life, and he knew that Luo Fan had already formed a complete world of the laws, even though it wasn't perfect. At this moment, he looked at Luo Fan as if he was looking at an unbelievable monster. It must be known that he knew better than Senior Sister Mei how difficult it was to go against the flow. He also knew how unbelievable it was for someone to be able to do this. Previously, he had only been interested in Luo Fan and wanted to learn the secret of resurrection from Luo Fan. Now, he had already made up his mind to kill Luo Fan. An abnormal existence who could go against the flow and grow beyond the record would definitely be his nightmare if he was allowed to grow. If this person was lucky enough to ascend to the 6th level, then even if he was a disciple of a Tao Master, he would definitely not be a match for him. In this case, in this hostile situation, the only thing he could do was to use his strongest means to kill Luo Fan before he grew up. Your killing intent is too strong. Luo Fan looked at this scene and sighed. He could not be clearer about the source of the waxen middle-aged man's killing intent. However, although he knew the source of the killing intent, there was no way for him to calm it down. After all, this kind of killing intent that was born from a different path was the most stubborn killing intent in the world. If he wanted to calm this kind of killing intent, the most direct way was to change his cultivation path and abolish the reverse path that he had spent countless years on. Only in this way could he make the waxen middle-aged man relax his vigilance and stop the strongest killing intent from targeting him. However, how could such a thing happen to Luo Fan? The reason why a path was because it was a cultivation path that he deeply recognized. If he could not even stick to the cultivation path that he deeply recognized, then how could he become a true saint? Wouldn't it be easier to find a place to live his life? You're too dangerous. I can't let you ascend, the waxen middle-aged man said faintly. At this moment, his entire body was surrounded by an incomparably powerful aura. This aura was so powerful that it almost completely enveloped the 4th level of the Tao Master's path. Under this aura, all the creation power on the Tao Master's path seemed to be grasped by invisible hands and began to circulate slowly and orderly. This method is countless times stronger than what I've encountered before. Looking at this scene, Luo Fan could not help but become serious. What he had encountered before was naturally the creation power domain displayed by the middle-aged individual cultivator, who had been sealed in the barrier between the reality plane and other planes. Although the method displayed by the waxen middle-aged man was many times larger than the creation power domain displayed by the middle-aged individual cultivator. But in essence, the two were the same thing. They were both forcefully manipulating the creation power to create a domain that was completely isolated from the outside world and completely under one's control. If Luo Fan had known how terrifying this kind of domain was, he would not have been in the mood to wait for it to take shape. At this moment, he casually grabbed at the void, and waves of creation power directly appeared in his hand. They began to quickly entangle and fuse, and finally, an increasingly powerful creation power appeared in his hand. After the creation power condensed to the size of a star, it suddenly condensed and turned into a 3-legged round cauldron, releasing a world-destroying aura and a terrifying aura that was enough to completely collapse the 4th level of the Tao Master's path. This kind of aura was naturally much weaker than the aura released by the waxen middle-aged man. However, it was only in terms of overall quantity. In a small area, this kind of aura was not any weaker than the one released by the waxen middle-aged man. Seeing Luo Fan display this three-legged round cauldron, senior sister May's expression changed. She suddenly found that the method displayed by Luo Fan seemed to be the same as before, but in fact, it was fundamentally different from what she had seen last time. In the past, although the three-legged round cauldron was powerful, it could at most use the power of the world group to a certain limit. But now, the three-legged round cauldron not only used the power of the world group to that limit, but also added the mysteries of the first three levels of the Town Master's path to it. The combination of the three levels and the cauldron formed a strange existence that was similar to the barrier between the domain of the Town Master and the domain of the individual cultivators. But it was fundamentally different. This kind of mysterious existence had even exceeded the scope of her understanding, causing her to be unable to guess exactly what kind of miraculous power the three-legged round cauldron possessed at this moment. Nor did she know how to block this three-legged round cauldron. He has already surpassed me in this level. Even if she could not believe it and was unwilling to admit it, senior sister May had to admit that it was a fact. The moment this thought flashed through her mind, her vigilance towards Luo Fan had already been raised to a level that was 10 times or even 100 times stronger than before. Her killing intent towards Luo Fan was no less than that of the waxen middle-aged man. This was not because she was jealous, but because she found that her original worries were gradually becoming a reality. I must kill him. I can't let him go any further. Senior sister May murmured, the killing intent in her eyes almost materializing. Obviously, the waxen middle-aged man was not in the mood to care about the changes that were happening to senior sister May. At this moment, he looked at the three-legged round cauldron that had appeared in front of Luo Fan and frowned. You're overestimating yourself. Even I can't perfectly integrate the mysteries of the various levels. You're just an ant on the 4th level. How dare you challenge this? At this moment, he had yet to completely construct the domain that was based on the entire 4th level of the Tao Master's path. At this moment, Luo Fan's three-legged round cauldron had already been completed. Due to the difference in scale, his speed was a step slower than Luo Fan's. At this moment, Luo Fan took action. The three-legged round cauldron suddenly slammed towards the waxen middle-aged man. This collision instantly shattered the surrounding creation power, causing the surrounding creation power, which had been frozen by the time attribute and could only be frozen in the void, to be completely shattered by this collision. The creation power, which could not move and could not flow at all, attached to the three-legged round cauldron and wrapped around it, as if the three-legged round cauldron was constantly releasing all kinds of smoke. Chapter 2246. However, the waxen middle-aged man only looked solemn. He didn't panic at all because of this attack that even shattered the power of the time attribute in his surroundings that had been frozen in place. It was as if this kind of attack was only enough to make him pay a little more attention to it. At this moment, the countless light shadows and the 4 mysterious mysteries inside the three-legged cauldron started to squirm, interweave, and change continuously. For an existence of this level, the attribute of time was something that could be manipulated at will. Therefore, even though the three-legged cauldron seemed to have transcended time and was crashing towards a waxen middle-aged man, there was still an infinite amount of time in the three-legged cauldron, which was enough to make all the powers, mysteries, and elements brew the changes that Luo Fan hoped to see. The various light shadows, powers, and mysteries had been brewing inside the three-legged cauldron for trillions of years. In the end, a bit of subtle light broke through the countless lights, shadows, powers, and eventually occupied all the space-time inside the three-legged round cauldron. As a result, the interior of the three-legged round cauldron was completely filled with this bit of light. It felt that all the other powers, lights, shadows, and mysteries became so small and insignificant in the face of this light. They couldn't even occupy a bit of space-time in this space-time inside the three-legged round cauldron. Is this all I can do? At this moment, Luo Fan, who was sensing all this, felt a tinge of regret. At this moment, There was a trace of a lively aura in the depths of this light. This lively aura was a sign of a will. If this lively aura could be nurtured and strengthened, it would eventually turn into a will that could think freely and possess great wisdom. However, it was a pity that this bit of active aura was simply too weak. It was so weak that if Luo Fan was not the owner of this light and the owner of the three-legged cauldron, he would not even be able to sense the existence of this lively aura. After discovering this lively aura, he naturally knew what Luo Fan had been doing for such a long time. He was impressively trying to condense that kind of light, or rather, that kind of power, by relying on his understanding of the light that Senior Sister May and the middle-aged row cultivator had displayed at the 5th level of the Tao Master's Road, which contained the level of the will of heaven and earth. Unfortunately, after such a long time of preparation and using up almost all of his intelligence and inspiration, although he had created the embryonic form of the light, in the end, he could only reach this level. He could barely make the light show a trace of spirituality that belonged to the will of the world. Not to mention Senior Sister May and the middle-aged row cultivator making the light look like a living thing. It was quite difficult to distinguish this light from normal spiritual light. However, although it only contained a trace of spiritual aura, it was still the condensation of all of Luo Fan's wisdom and inspiration. Compared to all of the other powers inside the three-legged cauldron, all of its power, all of its profundities, and all of its light and shadows, it was already many times stronger than it. When the light appeared, the time in the outside world just happened to flow to the time when the three-legged cauldron had arrived in front of the waxen middle-aged man. At this moment, the waxen middle-aged man's expression suddenly changed. He suddenly discovered that the aura of the three-legged cauldron in front of him had suddenly soared countless times. It was as if it had suddenly transformed from a missile model into a real missile. The degree of danger was already a world of difference from before in the blink of an eye. If it was said that the three-legged cauldron from before could only make him slightly take it seriously, and he was even confident that he could shatter it with a single finger, then this three-legged cauldron already made him feel that it could hurt him. At this critical moment, the waxen middle-aged man let out a soft cry. His palm appeared out of thin air in front of the three-legged cauldron and forcefully pressed down on it. Crack! An earth-shattering and terrifying thunderclap sounded from the point of contact between the two. A huge shock wave was released from that position in an instant and swept in all directions, directly shattering the endless creation power in the surroundings. As for the power of the time attribute that had stagnated the entire 4th level of the Tao Master's path that was disrupted by the shockwave, it instantly became chaotic. Amidst the chaos, all the power of creation in the Tao Master's path became chaotic. The creation power, which was originally distributed evenly, stagnated in some places and flowed rapidly in some places. It became bumpy and looked so ugly. The three-legged cauldron collapsed in an instant. Countless cracks wrapped around the three-legged cauldron in a manner that surpassed time. Then, as if at the same time, all the cracks suddenly expanded and directly turned the three-legged cauldron into countless fragments. The three-legged cauldron instantly turned into smoke and fell into the endless creation power in the surroundings. It was completely devoured by the creation power. You came down from the 5th level. The waxen middle-aged man's expression changed greatly at this moment. At this moment, his palm had already collapsed. The powerful shock wave passed through his collapsed palm to his arm, shoulder, and body, causing countless holes to appear on his body in an instant. Blood and power frantically flowed out. Such injuries seemed tragic, but for existences at their level, they were merely superficial wounds. Even if they ignored it, it would take millions of years for their foundation to be slightly shaken. Of course, even so, after suffering such an attack and being in such a sorry state, he should treat his injuries as soon as possible. After all, although it was not fatal, he still looked battered and exhausted. However, at this time, the waxen middle-aged man completely ignored the injuries on his body. He just stared in disbelief at the small light that was revealed after the three-legged cauldron shattered in front of him. It was like a candle in the wind. How keen was his senses? How vast was his knowledge? Naturally, he had already recognized the essence of the light at the first moment. He knew that the light was extremely similar to the mysteries of the fifth level of the Tao Master's Path. It could even be said that the two were existences of the same essence. And this was obviously impossible. After all, the display of the power of the Tao Master's prison made him completely certain that the rogue cultivator in front of him had never entered the fifth level. Because of this, he was so shocked and did not dare to believe the truth in front of him. At this moment, the light did not stop because of the waxen middle-aged man's words and power. Instead, it began to stir the endless creation power in the surroundings, causing the endless creation power to give birth to endless, unimaginable power. It surged towards the waxen middle-aged man in a manner that completely targeted him. Although the waxen middle-aged man was shocked by the existence of the light, he was extremely disdainful of the light's overestimation. After all, even if the light had a complete consciousness and looked like a living creature, it would not be able to do anything to him. It was impossible for it to move him at all, let alone the light in front of him that only had a little bit of spiritual aura. He even thought that even if he did not put up any defense, the light would not be able to break through his body and leave a mark on him. However, very soon, his expression changed drastically. He quickly dodged backwards and released countless rays of light from his body, condensing into layers of absolute defense around him, trying his best to resist the endless power that was derived from the creation power that was triggered by the light. At this moment, there was only one thought in his mind. How can it be so strong? It only has a little bit of spiritual aura. How can it be so strong? He could sense that the power derived from the boundless creation energy that was drawn by the light was completely targeting his weakness. It was targeting the weakness brought about by his advantage in controlling the time attribute around him. To control all the time attribute, it naturally required an extremely deep integration with the time attribute. In this way, the most effective way to deal with his attacks would be to similarly target the time attribute. This was naturally a very difficult thing for a practitioner like Luo Fan, who did not understand the source of his means. However, for the light, with a little bit of spiritual aura, it was almost instinctive. It did not even need any command from Luo Fan. It had already grasped the weakness of the waxen middle-aged man as soon as it came into contact with his aura. It could even derive corresponding attacks based on this weakness, which was enough to cause a huge blow to this weakness. In other words, the attack that the waxen middle-aged man was withstanding at this moment. From this moment on, the stagnation of the time attribute on the entire fourth level of the Tao Master's Path began to shrink rapidly. The stagnation that originally spread across the entire fourth level of the Tao Master's Path had already shrunk to the range of several world clusters around him in just a few breaths. As this stagnation shrank, the fourth level, which was originally full of potholes, began to become flat and smooth at an unimaginable speed. It looked as if a big hand had wiped the entire fourth level of the Tao Master's Path out of thin air, completely erasing all the potholes. What's this? How can it be so much stronger than the light of heaven and earth I condensed? At this time, Senior Sister May, who had regained her freedom, was filled with shock. Senior Sister May came from the fifth level of the Tao Master's Path. She was even more familiar with this kind of living light than the waxen middle-aged man from the sixth level, just like a high school student was more familiar with high school knowledge than a college student. Therefore, she naturally knew more about the strangeness of the light condensed by Luo Fan than the waxen middle-aged man. She could sense that the will of the world contained in that speck of light was so weak that it could not even compare to any of the individual cultivators on the fifth level who had embarked on the normal path of cultivation, let alone her. However, it was this kind of light that actually made the light of heaven and earth she condensed feel a trace of fear. It was as if that light was the natural enemy of her light of heaven and earth. How could this happen? She murmured. She felt that her worldview had been overturned, and she even began to doubt her own path of cultivation. With this change of mood, the light in her body faintly shone, and her aura began to wantonly release from her body. It stirred the surroundings in a chaotic manner, adding a part of her power to the chaos of the surrounding creation power. Wah! After a while, the chaos in her body reached a certain extreme, causing her body to suddenly become sluggish. She spat out a mouthful of blood. There was a faint light in this mouthful of blood. After it left her body, it began to change rapidly, absorbing the boundless power of creation in the surroundings. It began to give birth to all kinds of strange light shadows, power, space-time, world, heaven, and earth. However, all these derivations were quickly annihilated in the aftermath of the battle between the light and the waxen middle-aged man, as if they had never appeared. With this catharsis, although Senior Sister May's body was severely damaged, her mind was clear. This person is walking on the path of going against the flow of time, and it's a record-setting path of going against the flow of time. Perhaps it's because of this that the light of heaven and earth that he condensed is a little special. It's not a problem with my cultivation. This thought suppressed all the messy thoughts in her heart, allowing her to sort out her thoughts again. However, although she suppressed all the negative thoughts in her heart, there were still some doubts in her heart. After all, there was still a reason why the path of going against the flow of time was special. Explaining everything with the uniqueness of the path of going against the flow of time was still a form of evasion. For Luo Fan's light of heaven and earth, which only contained a weak spiritual aura, to be so much more powerful than the light of heaven and earth that she condensed, there should be an explanation that she could understand. However, although there were still some doubts in her heart, after the blow, just now, Senior Sister May already knew that it was impossible for her to get any results by dwelling on it. Instead, it would cause her to go berserk. Therefore, she could only forcefully suppress this trace of doubt and plan to wait until she could face this doubt more rationally in the future before investigating the reason behind it. At this moment, she only started to repair her body and cautiously guarded against the aftermath of the battle that could drown her at any time. At this moment, the waxen middle-aged man was already exhausted from running for his life. All sorts of different means were constantly appearing in his hands as he pounced towards the light, trying his best to destroy it. However, all of his means seemed to have been predicted by the light. No matter how strange the means were, the light seemed to be controlling the creation power at the same time to counter it, and it easily resisted it. It even countered the weakness of the waxen middle-aged man's new means, forcing the waxen middle-aged man to change his means to resist. Chapter 2247. The reason why Luo Fan's so-called light of the heavens and earth had such unimaginable power in such an imperfect situation was actually very simple. It was because he had personally simulated the true will of the heavens and earth. He did not know how to cultivate the fifth level of the Tao Master's path and how to condense a light of heaven and earth that was similar to the will of heaven and earth. However, even if this was the Tao Master's path, even if it was really built out of thin air, it was unlikely for any cultivator who had entered the fifth level of the Tao Master's path to become the will of heaven and earth. If one did not personally become the will of heaven and earth, then no matter how much research and analysis one had on the will of heaven and earth, it would ultimately be like scratching an itch through one's boot. What one had obtained was merely the surface of the will of heaven and earth, and could not truly obtain the essence of the will of heaven and earth. In this way, the light of the world that they had condensed seemed to possess a perfect will that was similar to the will of the world, making it seem as if it was alive. However, it was actually just a living will with a trace of the nature of the will of heaven and earth. Even the trace of the will of heaven and earth was superficial, and it was difficult for one to truly obtain the true power of the will of heaven and earth. In contrast, Luo Fan had not gone through the fifth level of the Tao Master's path at all. He had completely relied on his own deduction and tried his best to condense the light of heaven and earth with all the cultivation achievements he had mastered. Naturally, it was many times more difficult than the cultivators who had the guidance of the fifth level. However, it was precisely because of this that he was able to completely integrate all kinds of understanding and traces left behind in the process of simulating the will of heaven and earth into the light, and then make the will contained in the light more similar to the will of heaven and earth than the will contained in the light of heaven and earth condensed by most of the fifth level cultivators. At least, in comparison, the level of the will contained in the light of heaven and earth condensed by Senior Sister May and the waxen middle-aged man could not compare to the spiritual aura contained in the light. As for whether the light of heaven and earth condensed by other fifth-level cultivators was more similar to the will of heaven and earth than his, it was not something that could be found out for now. Luo Fan naturally did not understand all of this in the beginning. However, as time passed, as the changes that the speck of light displayed became more and more powerful, and as the difference between this speck of light and the light that he had come into contact with before became more and more obvious, he gradually understood the crux of the matter. A smile of enlightenment gradually appeared on his face. So that's how it is. So they're not as strong as I thought, he muttered. There was joy in his heart, but also an indescribable sense of loss. To him, all of his experiences, all of his methods, and all of his decisions were all for the sake of improving himself and allowing him to comprehend new things, allowing him to take a step closer to becoming a true divine. Under such circumstances, the stronger the enemy was, the more ingenious the enemy's methods would be. Although it would be more dangerous for him, it would also bring him more enlightenment and more rewards. The higher-level cultivators were weaker than he had imagined. This made the danger he might encounter less, but it also made the things he could learn less. This naturally made him happy, but also a little disappointed. After understanding the intrinsic advantage of the light of heaven and earth that he had condensed, he could not be clearer about how he should make use of it. At this moment, all of his senses, comprehension, and thoughts from the process of simulating the will of the world in the shattered world appeared out of thin air again, and he poured them into the speck of light without holding back. As a huge amount of information was poured in, the spiritual aura in the speck of light began to skyrocket. However, this skyrocketing did not make the light transform into a living thing. On the contrary, it made the light transform in a direction that became less and less existent. It was as if it had unknowingly become a phenomenon in the world, a rule of the operation of the great Tao, and a strange manifestation of the chaotic state. As this change occurred, the range of its control over the surrounding creation power became larger, and the changes produced by the creation power also became more complicated and profound. The power it produced also became more and more terrifying. Originally, the waxen middle-aged man could barely cope with it, but at this moment, after the light changed, he realized that the pressure he had to endure had suddenly skyrocketed by many times. Previously, it was as if all of his methods, past and future, had been seen by the other party. This way, no matter what he used, he would encounter the most targeted response, making it difficult for his methods to truly be effective. However, at the end of the day, he still had the freedom to choose how to attack and how to change his methods. However, at this moment, he realized that he had already become a part of the other party. All of his methods seemed to be responding to the other party, and in the end, they were all used by the other party to create a terrible environment for him, making his situation worse and worse. Unknowingly, he had already fallen into the worst situation he could imagine. All the attacks that he had launched before that could threaten him were coming from all directions. At this moment, these attacks completely treated him as a target, making him feel like the shadow of death had completely shrouded him. How did it develop to this extent? At this moment, this thought flashed across the waxen, middle-aged man's mind. With this thought in mind, everything that he had done and used previously appeared in his mind again. Even when he thought back, he felt that there was no problem with his response at all. All of the changes in his abilities and methods were the best response to the situation at that time. However, it was precisely because of this that everything that was incomparably correct had finally developed into this situation. He could be completely torn apart in the next moment, and everything would turn into bubbles, Everything seemed to be the result of countless coincidences piling up together. Why? How can such a silent method appear on a cultivator who hasn't even stepped into the 5th level? This thought kept flashing in his mind. With this thought, his body gradually became illusory, as if some kind of power was pulling him out of the 4th level. Silently, the area where he had originally been was completely annihilated. All the power of creation gave birth to countless destructive powers at this moment, constantly transmitting in all directions. In the blink of an eye, it had already swept through the entire 4th level of the Tao Master's path, causing almost all the nature of the power of creation to change. Fortunately, the source of the power of creation in the 4th level of the Tao Master's path was the entire Tao Master's path. Under such circumstances, as long as the source was not affected, even if the power of creation was completely subverted and destroyed, it could quickly recover. Therefore, in the eyes of Luo Fan, it was only a moment, but in the eyes of the power of creation itself, all the changes of the power of creation completely disappeared in a period of time that seemed to be millions of years. The entire 4th level of the Tao Master's path looked no different from the beginning, as if nothing had happened. At this moment, the barrier that originally covered the entire 4th level of the Tao Master's path and completely separated the domain of the individual cultivators and the domain of the Tao Master's path also disappeared at the same time, leaving no trace. The domain of the individual cultivators and the domain of the Tao Master's path, which were originally completely separated, were now completely integrated as if they had never been separated. At this moment, the entire 4th level of the Tao Master's path was no longer as empty as before. Countless individual cultivators were constantly struggling, recovering from the erosion of the power of creation again and again, trying hard to prevent themselves from being assimilated by the power of creation. The clusters of worlds constructed by the many itinerant cultivators were like specks of light in the boundless darkness. They provided a place for the many itinerant cultivators to settle down. So most of them would not end up like the itinerant cultivators who could not make it to the clusters of worlds in time, constantly being destroyed by the power of creation and struggling with great difficulty. You've achieved your goal, haven't you? At this moment, Senior Sister May's somewhat inexplicable voice came into his ears. Luo Fan smiled slightly, raised his hand, and the light that exuded spiritual aura fell into his hand, turning into a small flame that floated like a candle. Then, he turned his head to look at the source of the voice. Senior Sister May floated there, surrounded by the power of the world clusters, completely isolating herself from the power of creation in the outside world. There was an unconcealable sorrow in her eyes, which made her originally charming and inexplicably pitiful, which made her even more alluring. I've only reached the first step. Luo Fan did not hide, and just said so. Isn't your goal to liberate the individual cultivators? To let the individual cultivators have the same cultivation environment as us Tao Masters? Senior Sister May frowned and said, "Who told you that my purpose was this?" Luo Fan just smiled and asked back, "Who else needs to tell you? Every action and every decision you make is for this result, isn't it?" Senior Martial Sister May's expression remained the same as before. Luo Fan laughed and said, No. What does the grudges and treatment between the Tao Masters and the individual cultivators have to do with me? It doesn't matter if the individual cultivators have a poor cultivation environment or a wonderful one. What does it matter to me?" Senior Sister May's eyes were filled with surprise. She had always thought that Luo Fan was doing it for the rights of the individual cultivators, and because of this, she felt that Luo Fan's thoughts were so dangerous. After all, an enemy with strength, will, and ideas was the most dangerous enemy. However, if Luo Fan only had strength and ideas, but no will, it would still not be safe, but the degree of danger would be much smaller than before. Then what's your goal? Senior Sister May frowned and asked. There was doubt in her eyes, but suddenly she had a flash of inspiration. She remembered how Luo Fan had treated the disciples of the Tao Masters in the 4th level. She could not help but exclaim, "You want to take all the individual cultivators into your own world group and let them help you cultivate?" After saying this, she looked at Luo Fan as if she was looking at a madman. It was acceptable for him to treat the disciples of the Tao Masters like this. The more ruthless he was, the more prestige he would have in the hearts of the individual cultivators. The more powerful the individual cultivators were, the more favorable they would be to him. However, if he treated the rogue cultivators and the disciples of the Tao Master equally, and treated all the rogue cultivators the same way he treated the disciples of the Tao Master, then in the eyes of the rogue cultivators, he would be a madman who would bite anyone he saw. Not to mention that the lower-level individual cultivators would see him as an enemy. Even the higher-level individual cultivators might not like him and attack him. This was equivalent to cutting off all the other cultivators. Madman, you're a complete madman, Senior Sister May said with a look of horror. Hearing this, Luo Fan did not take it seriously. He smiled and said, "Haven't I always been a madman in your eyes? If I'm not a madman, why would I choose the wrong path?" Hearing this, Senior Sister May did not relax at all. She still looked at Luo Fan as if she was looking at a madman. However, there was an additional sense of pity in her eyes. You're finished. Unless you never ascend, once you step into the 5th level, you will no longer have a foothold. Whether it's the disciples of the Tao Masters or the individual cultivators, they will definitely kill you the moment you appear. Hearing this, Luo Fan's expression did not even change. He said, "If that's the case, then there's nothing I can do. I entered the Tao Master's path to constantly improve myself and eventually become a Tao Master. I didn't enter to join any organization to be kind to others. The disciples of the Tao Masters? Individual cultivators? What's the difference between becoming a true divine? Since ancient times, I've never heard that it's easier for an individual cultivator to become a sage than a Tao Master. I've also never heard that it's easier for a Tao Master to become a sage than an individual cultivator. If that's the case, what's the point of forcibly dividing yourself into groups?" Senior Sister May's expression froze slightly. She did not expect Luo Fan to say such a thing. This was actually not a great secret. In fact, from ancient times to the present, anyone who had some understanding of the Tao Master's background would know that among all the Tao Masters, there was not much difference in the ratio between those who were originally disciples of the Tao Master and those who were originally individual cultivators. That was to say, the ratio of all the disciples of a Tao Master and the ratio of the individual cultivators to the Tao Master was very small. It was as if becoming a Tao Master had nothing to do with all the previous cultivation methods. It was completely dependent on the final opportunity. Under such circumstances, the theory that becoming a Tao Master had nothing to do with the previous identity naturally came into being. However, for the disciples of a Tao Master, this conclusion was obviously not something they were willing to accept. Therefore, after a long period of cultivation, they became more and more aware that the gap between the disciples of a Tao Master and the individual cultivators became larger and larger with the improvement of their cultivation realms. This theory had been unknowingly ignored by all the disciples of a Tao Master. It was almost their wishful thinking that becoming a disciple of a Tao Master meant that one was naturally closer to becoming a Tao Master than an individual cultivator. Becoming a disciple of a Tao Master meant that the probability of becoming a Tao Master was naturally higher than that of an individual cultivator. Senior Sister May was also a disciple of one of the Tao Masters who had unknowingly ignored this theory. However, at this time, when she heard Luo Fan using such a theory to support her crazy behavior, the barrier that had originally covered her mind was finally completely broken. It reminded her of the statistics about the origin of the Tao Master that had been secretly circulated all along. A kind of inexplicable confusion gradually emerged from the bottom of her heart. Along with this bewilderment, the doubts she had accumulated about the strange power of Luo Fan's light of the world also appeared. Originally, she had already suppressed this doubt because it might shake the foundation of her cultivation and the way of her cultivation. Under such circumstances, even if she forcibly suppressed this doubt, in the end, it could only treat the symptoms but not the root cause. Once things changed, this doubt would naturally resurface. After all, doubt was doubt. Even if you suppressed it, you would just ignore it. This kind of neglect was like deceiving oneself and others. When this deception was uncovered, it would naturally erupt again. And now, Luo Fan's words, which coincided with the previous secret statistics, were like a powerful hand that uncovered all the deceptions that she had been deceiving others and herself. This made the doubts that had been suppressed in the bottom of her heart finally burst out without reservation. With this eruption of doubt, the aura of her body began to inexplicably become chaotic. At this time, the light of heaven and earth, which she had originally condensed with difficulty, involuntarily emerged from her body and began to sway around her body, causing the surrounding power of creation to constantly change in various strange forms in the process. This kind of change was somewhat similar to the various changes that had occurred when Luo Fan's light of heaven and earth fought with the waxen middle-aged man. But it was far less flexible, natural, and untraceable than the changes caused by Luo Fan's light of heaven and earth. If one had to forcibly compare the two, one was like the real heaven and earth, while the other was like a crude, artificial simulation of heaven and earth. On purpose? At this time, Luo Fan suddenly frowned, and this thought flashed through his mind. Chapter 2248. The power of the Tao Master's prison was not only extremely strict, but also extremely forgiving. It was extremely forgiving towards all cultivators who did not go against the Tao Master's path from the upper levels to the lower levels. Even if such a cultivator displayed power and methods that exceeded this level and caused harm to other living beings, it would not care at all, nor would it punish the living beings. However, it was extremely strict towards all cultivators who went against the Tao Master's path from the upper levels to the lower levels. As long as such a cultivator displayed any methods that exceeded the limits of this level, it would naturally descend and impose the strongest punishment on him, unless that cultivator was strong enough to restrict the power of the Tao Master's prison, just like the waxen middle-aged man from before. As soon as he appeared, he directly froze the power of the Tao Master's prison and conveniently expelled it from the fourth level of the Tao Master's path. He even forcibly grabbed Senior Sister May's body that was about to enter the Tao Master's prison. After that, he casually displayed the various gains he had obtained from the sixth level without triggering any reaction from the Tao Master's prison. However, it was obvious that Senior Sister May was not as strong as the waxen middle-aged man. Under such circumstances, when he suddenly displayed the light of heaven and earth that could only be obtained from the fifth level of the Tao Master's path, it naturally triggered a reaction from the Tao Master's prison, causing the Tao Master's prison to descend its power to punish her. Luo Fan frowned as he watched the light of heaven and earth on Senior Sister May's body continuously release its own power amidst the chaos. He watched as the power of the Tao Master's prison wrapped around her and locked onto her body. Then, he watched as the power of the Tao Master's prison gradually pulled her away from the fourth level. In the end, when she completely disappeared without a trace, he could not help but be a little stunned. Was she trying to escape? It can't be. Isn't the price too high to use such a method to escape? He thought to himself, his eyes filled with shock and uncertainty. He originally thought that Senior Sister May was plotting something and intended to resist him. However, he did not expect that in the end, she would directly disappear in front of him, causing his vigilance to be completely futile. After thinking for a long time, he still couldn't figure out what was going on with Senior Sister May. In the end, he could only put this question aside. After all, Senior Sister May had already been dragged into the Tao Master's prison. Under such circumstances, it was impossible for him to directly go to the Tao Master's prison to ask her what she was thinking. In fact, even if he went all out and directly entered the Tao Master's prison, he could not be sure that he would really be able to see Senior Sister May. What a pity, he sighed. With a sway of his body, he returned to his world cluster and sat in the center of the world cluster. After thinking about it, he casually grabbed the middle-aged rogue cultivator who had been sealed in the barrier between the levels out and appeared in front of him. The middle-aged cultivator was still in the same state as before he was sealed, be it his thoughts, his mind, or his movements. It was as if his time had been completely frozen by Luo Fan. In fact, the middle-aged cultivator had indeed been frozen in time by Luo Fan. In the barrier between the levels, the attribute of time itself did not exist. In this way, the middle-aged cultivator's attribute of time, which was completely sealed in the barrier, was as if it did not exist. This was no different from being frozen. At this moment, the middle-aged rogue cultivator seemed to be in front of Luo Fan, and it seemed like he was no different from being released. However, in reality, he was still in a sealed state and could not move at all. Even his perception of time had been completely removed. At this moment, his thoughts were still at the moment when he was sealed. Let me see how much stronger you are compared to the disciples of the Tao Master. As he muttered, Luo Fan pressed the crude light of heaven and earth in his hand towards the middle-aged cultivator. Under his control, the barrier between the levels naturally did not have any effect on the light. The light easily penetrated the barrier and entered the middle-aged cultivator's body. After the light entered, the middle-aged cultivator's body gradually glowed. In a trance, it was as if he had suddenly turned into a sun. Amidst the light, the middle-aged cultivator's body gradually disintegrated and melted. Unknowingly, he had already turned into streams of air that continuously dispersed in the barrier between the levels. Shortly after, the crude light of heaven and earth began to change. The light abruptly disintegrated into billions of parts, enveloping the countless parts of the middle-aged rogue cultivator. It penetrated the barrier between the planes and shot towards the countless heavens and earths, countless worlds, and countless spacetimes in this group of worlds. The light contained the spiritual aura of the will of the world. It was so powerful that it was even more terrifying than the light of heaven and earth that Senior Sister may have cast with her complete consciousness. Suppressing the will of the middle-aged cultivator, which had been disintegrated into billions of parts, was naturally an extremely easy task. At this moment, although the middle-aged cultivator had broken away from the barrier between the levels, he was still in a daze. It was difficult for him to form effective thoughts, let alone perceive the changes in the outside world. Under such circumstances, Luo Fan easily allowed the crude light of the heavens and earth to bring the body parts of the middle-aged rogue cultivator straight into the heavens and earth, each world, each space-time, and directly integrated into the cycle of reincarnation. They turned into living creatures that lived and struggled in the heavens and earth, each world, each space-time. Although these creatures that were thrown into the reincarnation were products of billions of parts, after all, the source came from the middle-aged cultivator. They were part of a powerful cultivator who had at least come from the 5th level of the road to Tao Master. Under such circumstances, these creatures that were thrown into the various worlds, and space-times naturally possessed aptitudes that far surpassed the native creatures in these worlds, and space-times. They had far surpassed the native creatures in these worlds, and space-times. In the beginning, those creatures that were thrown into the reincarnation were just some low-level, unintelligent creatures. However, after several reincarnations, they had enough time to grow and absorbed enough nutrients in the reincarnation. Soon, they broke away from the low-level creatures and gained their own intelligence. With this intelligence, they began to step onto the road of cultivation at an unimaginable speed. Very soon, they reached a very high level in their respective worlds, and space-times. When they reached a very high level, they gradually began to realize that they were different from other cultivators in their respective worlds, and space-times. It was as if there was a voice in their hearts constantly reminding them that they had a mission that was far beyond the imagination of other creatures. Their existence was not just for cultivation, nor was it for improvement, but for a more noble and greater purpose. However, although they were sure that they had a mission and purpose, they could not find the root of it. They could not find their mission and purpose. Not long after, most of these body parts voluntarily threw themselves into the reincarnation and began a new round of reincarnation. Just like that, reincarnation after reincarnation, cultivation after cultivation, confusion after confusion, then a new reincarnation, a new cultivation, and a new confusion. Just like that, it formed an almost endless cycle. It was precisely because of this that the living beings transformed from the body parts of these middle-aged rogue cultivators were countless times more difficult and painful than the living beings that were born and bred in the heaven and earth, the world and the time and space, and even the rogue cultivators under the town master who had been thrown into them by Luo Fan before. Is this the struggle of a half-awake and half-dreaming person? Luo Fan sighed in his heart as he sensed the struggle of these creatures in the center of the world group. Even he felt pain when he saw this struggle, let alone the many body parts that had experienced it. However, even though he felt pain when he looked at it, he did not have the slightest idea of solving the struggle of the middle-aged rogue cultivator's body parts. It was not only because the middle-aged cultivator had attacked him so many times, but also because he could clearly feel that his scattered light of heaven and earth was constantly growing. It was as if every struggle, every reincarnation, and every moment of confusion provided the light of heaven and earth with a large amount of resources to grow. The light of heaven and earth was a technique that could only be condensed at the 5th level of the Tao Master's Path. For such an existence, it was already extremely rare for Luo Fan to be able to condense such a rough, embryonic form. It was even more difficult for him to make it grow than for him to ascend. Under such circumstances, it was almost impossible to see the light of heaven and earth grow. Even Luo Fan himself had given up this hope. Under such circumstances, he could suddenly sense the growth of the light of heaven and earth at an unimaginable speed. It was easy to imagine how joyous it was for him. Compared to the rewards, the price to pay for such benefits was nothing more than the pain of one's enemy. Was there a need to say anything more about this decision? Why would there be growth? Luo Fan thought to himself. He immediately put aside his original plan of pulling all the rogue cultivators into his world group to help his countless worlds, and space-time grow. With a thought, his mind flashed, and he was about to enter a certain world, into the traces of light of heaven and earth hidden in the body of the middle-aged rogue cultivator. The light of heaven and earth seemed to be only a trace, but because it contained endless mysteries, its interior was as complex as countless worlds. Even if Luo Fan wanted to hide his entire world group within it, it would be a piece of cake for him, let alone a trace of his mind. As such, even though there was an additional trace of Luo Fan's mind in his body, the body of the middle-aged rogue cultivator still did not notice anything. It continued to reincarnate, cultivate, grow, be lost, and reincarnate again. The cycle continued. This wisp of Luo Fan's mind was hidden in the light of heaven and earth, sensing the changes in this part of his body, sensing the various subtle thoughts it had during this process, as well as how the light of heaven and earth absorbed those traces of resources to strengthen itself during this process. In this world group, the flow of time in every world and space-time was almost independent. It was not related to any time attribute in the outside world. Under such circumstances, only a few years had passed in Luo Fan's body, but tens of billions of years had passed in the world that his mind had entered. Over these tens of billions of years, the body of the middle-aged rogue cultivator would cultivate to a point of confusion every 30 million years on average. He would not be able to think or even cultivate, and had no choice but to go through a new cycle of reincarnation. Just like that, the body of the middle-aged rogue cultivator had reincarnated over 1,000 times over the past tens of billions of years. Luo Fan's mind, which was hidden within the wisp of light of heaven and earth in his body, saw every single change that took place in the process of over 1,000 reincarnations. He had made countless deductions and calculations about the effects of all these changes in an attempt to find the source of the growth of the light of heaven and earth. After so many reincarnations, the answer that Luo Fan needed had unknowingly appeared. It's actually because of this. When he obtained the answer, Luo Fan could not help but feel a little confused. The reason why his light of heaven and earth grew was the same reason why the living being formed by the body of the middle-aged rogue cultivator would feel lost and unable to accept it after cultivating to a certain level. It was because the traces of light of heaven and earth naturally resonated with the will of the world when they reincarnated in the world, and the space-time. The light of heaven and earth contained the spiritual aura of the will of the world. The existence of this spiritual aura represented the same kind to the will of the world. The will of the world also possessed a complete will, the ability to think, and all the characteristics that all intelligence should have. However, all of this was fundamentally different from the will of living beings. No will of living beings could understand the situation of its existence, let alone communicate with it. Under such circumstances, the will of the world would naturally communicate with it in a way that living beings could not understand when it discovered its own kind. Chapter 2249. It was this tiny light of heaven and earth that resonated with the will of heaven and earth, causing the light of heaven and earth to gradually be influenced by the will of heaven and earth and grow unknowingly. As a result, the light of heaven and earth would continue to grow as time passed, as the middle-aged cultivator's body parts reincarnated. In other words, whether or not the middle-aged cultivator's body parts reincarnated did not matter to the light of heaven and earth. After figuring this out, Luo Fan thought about it again and understood why the living creature formed from the body parts of the middle-aged rogue cultivator was so different from other cultivators. It was because every time he cultivated to a certain level, he would become confused, give up everything, and reincarnate to seek his own mission, his own meaning. This was because they were affected by the light of heaven and earth and could vaguely sense the existence of the will of heaven and earth. If they could grasp this feeling, it would naturally be extremely beneficial to them. However, with the incomplete state of the body parts, once they sensed the will of heaven and earth, they would naturally be eroded by the will of heaven and earth. Naturally, their mentality and spirit would move closer to the will of heaven and earth. From the perspective of the will of heaven and earth, such a move would naturally awaken and be gradually understood by the will of heaven and earth. However, to the will of living beings, this meant that they were at a loss. They were at a loss and could not find their own meaning. They could not find the mission that they seemed to exist for. As a result, they would reincarnate again and again in the heaven and earth, the world, and space-time. Time and time again, they would work hard to grow and then become lost and lost again. I didn't expect it to be like this. Luo Fan could not help but let out a long sigh when he understood all this. However, his heart was completely relaxed. Even though he knew that he had spent so many years to catch the wrong target, he did not regret it at all. After all, no matter how he had originally planned to search for the source, he had still found it in the end. He even vaguely knew how to strengthen this random growth that could only rely on luck. Under such circumstances, did it matter how much time he had spent and how many wrong directions he had caught? As for the light of heaven and earth that caused the middle-aged cultivator's body parts to suffer, he did not feel the slightest bit guilty. After all, this middle-aged rogue cultivator was his enemy, no matter how he looked at it. Since they were enemies, they naturally could use any means. Even if Luo Fan were to kill him directly, it would not be excessive, let alone let him suffer some undeserved calamity. With a thought, he waved his hand. The strands of light of the world that had fused with the middle-aged itinerant cultivator's body left his body and quickly gathered towards his body. In the blink of an eye, it had already gathered into a weak candle flame in his hand. Compared to before, although this light was still at the candlelight level, the spiritual aura within it was several times stronger than before. With the power that every bit of spiritual aura could exert, this candlelight could clearly exert a terrifying power that was several times or even dozens of times stronger than before. Sensing the changes in the light of heaven and earth, his heart moved slightly. With a point of his finger, the light of heaven and earth entered the endless group of worlds around him. In a small space-time, it directly turned into a wisp of the rules of that space-time. It began to interact with the countless other rules of that space-time. It gradually integrated into that space-time and was incorporated into its own operating system by the great Tao of space-time. Along with this operating system, it gradually formed a closer and closer connection with the will of the world that even Luo Fan could not directly contact. Under Luo Fan's will, the flow of time in this space-time began to accelerate rapidly. When 3 years had passed in his body, the time in that space-time had already passed for billions of years. After billions of years of contact and influence, the light of heaven and earth had grown many times. If it was gathered together, although the light still belonged to a candle flame, it had changed from a birthday candle to a candlelight dinner candle. As for the spiritual aura contained in it, it had also grown greatly. Even if it was still a spiritual aura, it was several times stronger than before. Compared to when it was scattered into the countless heavens and earths, worlds, and space-time, it was several times faster. Looks like this method is indeed effective. Sensing that the light of heaven and earth's growth in that space-time had been restricted, Luo Fan knew that it was time to change places. Immediately, he raised his hand and beckoned. The light of heaven and earth that had been fused with this space-time for tens of billions of years directly separated itself from the layer of laws and laws it resided in. It then left the space-time and came directly to Luo Fan's palm, gathering into a candle flame that was several times stronger than before. Then, with a thought from Luo Fan, the light of heaven and earth charged into another space-time and began a process similar to the last time. Through various subtle changes, it finally connected with the will of heaven and earth in this space-time, learning from the will of heaven and earth and gradually improving itself. Just like that, the years of his main body's life and the billions of years in that space-time passed. The much stronger light of the world once again left that world and returned to Luo Fan's body, falling into his palm once again. With another turn, it entered another space-time. Just like that, several years passed, and then several years, and then several years. Unknowingly, millions of years had passed. During these millions of years, the light of heaven and earth would complete a growth in a certain space-time, a certain world, or even a certain part of the world every few years. Every time it grew, it would bring great benefits to the light of heaven and earth, causing the light of heaven and earth to grow, to become as dazzling as the sun. It seemed to be even more powerful than the light of heaven and earth that Senior Sister May, the middle-aged independent cultivator, and even the waxen middle-aged man could unleash. At this moment, the light of heaven and earth floated in Luo Fan's hand, but it could no longer shrink in his palm like a candle flame like before. Instead, it released endless light and illuminated his surroundings. It even looked like a sun had appeared out of nowhere in this cluster of worlds. However, although the light had become so powerful, the spirituality in the light of heaven and earth was still at the level of aura. In other words, it still did not have a complete will of heaven and earth. It was still just the spirituality of the will of heaven and earth. This had been going on for a long time in the recent cycles of the heavens and earth. From the beginning, Luo Fan had chosen heaven and earth, worlds, and space-times for the light of heaven and earth according to the order of time. In other words, it was according to the time period when he first created these worlds, and space-times. The space-times and worlds he chose at the beginning were the space-times, small thousand worlds, and medium thousand worlds that he created before he even reached the innate zenith heaven. After that, the light of heaven and earth grew and improved again and again. Then, he pushed back time and put into the space-time or world that was created after the time period represented by the chosen space-time or world. It was only when he could no longer gain anything from the levels of these worlds and could no longer allow the light of heaven and earth to grow further did he toss it aside and choose the next level of space-time and worlds. He did this over and over again. Most recently, he had chosen the worlds and worlds he had created on his path to becoming a Tao master. Even so, he sensed that the growth of the light of heaven and earth's spiritual aura had stagnated. This made him understand that he probably couldn't use this method to transform the light of heaven and earth's essence and make it complete from its fragmented state. This could not help but make him a little annoyed. However, he only felt annoyed for a while before he recovered. After all, he was now only at the 4th level of the Tao Master Path. Compared to the cultivators who had entered the 5th level of the Tao Master Path, he still lacked the corresponding cultivation environment. Under such circumstances, it was actually an incredible achievement to be able to condense the light of heaven and earth to this extent. If he wanted to make the light of heaven and earth completely ignore the original restrictions and completely take shape at the 4th level, it would obviously be too greedy. The accumulation can no longer have an effect on the light of heaven and earth. I'm afraid that only a great stimulation can make it complete the last step of transformation. Luo Fan looked at the light of heaven and earth that was like the sun for a long time, and then let out a long sigh. At this moment, the power of the light of heaven and earth had already reached an unimaginable level. In contrast, the power of the group of worlds, and even the power of the product formed by the combination of the mysteries of the first 4 levels of the Tao Master Path, were nothing. At this moment, if he encountered his old self, he would definitely be able to completely erase his old self without even lifting a finger. This was the case both in reality and in all other levels after a million years of development. The situation at the 4th level of the Tao Master Path was different from before. Although a million years was not a long time for cultivators, it was more than enough for them to sort out an orderly theory and change their original wrong ideas. In this way, they had studied clearly the danger of being devoured and assimilated by the creation power that they had been panicking about. After studying this clearly, the countless independent cultivators who had been hiding in the many groups of worlds or struggling to resist the creation power came out one by one. They either worked hard to open up their own groups of worlds or began to work hard to cultivate in their own groups of worlds that had been formed for a million years. Because of this, the 4th level of the Tao Master's Path, which was originally like the end of the world, was now thriving. It seemed to be even more lively and vigorous than the Tao Master's domain. Even though countless independent cultivators had almost condensed their own groups of worlds, Luo Fan's group of worlds was still the most conspicuous scene in the entire 4th level of the Tao Master Path. The group of worlds itself was incomparably large, far larger than the group of worlds of ordinary independent cultivators. Coupled with the hundreds of millions of worlds around the group of worlds and the even larger whirlpool in the outside world, it even seemed to occupy a 3rd or 4th of the entire 4th level of the Tao Master Path. With such an existence standing in the 4th level, countless independent cultivators naturally regarded it as the center of the entire 4th level. Unknowingly, their own groups of worlds began to build in all directions around this position. Under such circumstances, the entire 4th level now looked like a huge galaxy, densely dotted with countless stars amidst the endless pitch-black power of creation. There were wisps of blood-red smoke that wandered within the endless power of creation. There were all kinds of strange emotions that constantly revealed themselves. Everywhere it passed, images, worlds, and expanses of space-time appeared. There were all sorts of strange noises that echoed in the world of creation energy. What a pity, if only he had seen through the truth earlier. This was the voice of the independent cultivator, mourning for his friend who had died in the creation power. Damn it, if it weren't for you, how could brotherly have died? This was the voice of the independent cultivator, blaming someone for pulling his friend out of the creation power. Alas, my poor son. This was the voice of his children who had died in it. All kinds of resentment, accompanied by the blood-red smoke, wandered endlessly in the entire 4th level of the Tao Master Path. And this blood-red smoke suddenly entered a group of worlds, turning into many worlds, and space-time, causing a disaster that was close to a catastrophe. Then it suddenly entered the heart of a certain cultivator, wreaking havoc in his mind, almost causing him to suffer from chi deviation. These are the various regrets, pain, and negative emotions of countless cultivators. Because they were too powerful, they were eventually seized by the endless creation power and became the basis for some creation power, causing the creation power to produce changes that were similar to those in the group of worlds. It also gave these negative emotions something to rely on, becoming a kind of existence that would never be worn out or consumed. It began to vent on all living beings that it could come into contact with. Chapter 2250. The blood-red smoke was like a virus in the mortal world. No matter what it came into contact with, it would deteriorate. Whether it was the worlds, the itinerant cultivators, or the creation energy. Because of this, even though the blood-red mist itself wasn't huge, it continued to expand as time passed. It was as if it was growing at every moment. Every time it came into contact with a world group formed by an itinerant cultivator, it would cause great damage to the world group. At the same time, it would also suffer slight wear and tear, causing it to shrink a little. Of course, compared to the shrinking of the blood-red smoke, the itinerant cultivator's world group suffered great damage. Even the world group that suffered the least damage had 1/10 of the worlds, and space-time completely destroyed. As a result, the itinerant cultivator that formed the world group had no choice but to immerse himself in the creation energy again. He used the power of the creation energy to grab the worlds, and space-time that belonged to him in the river of time, and slowly recover the various memories that he had lost due to the destruction of the world group. In comparison, the itinerant cultivator's loss from the blood-red smoke was much greater than the loss of the world group. For the itinerant cultivators, being engulfed by the blood-red smoke was equivalent to losing half of their lives. Not a single itinerant cultivator would truly die from the countless negative emotions contained in the blood-red smoke. However, not a single itinerant cultivator could remain unharmed from the corrosion of the smoke either. Even the strongest itinerant cultivator, even the most determined itinerant cultivator, became muddle-headed under the corrosion of the blood-red smoke. It was as if they were completely controlled by the blood-red smoke, and they were almost swept along by the smoke to provide assistance to it. Fortunately, although the smoke itself was extremely powerful, it was still smoke in the end. Due to the chaos in itself, it was unable to perfectly unleash its power. Naturally, it was unable to turn those independent cultivators into evil beings. It could only bring chaos to those independent cultivators, causing them to stay where they were and fall into a state of chi deviation. Only when the blood-red mist had truly left and no longer affected the wandering cultivator did the wandering cultivator regain a bit of his mind and reason. Only then did he try his best to expel the residual side effects of the blood-red mist and recover with great difficulty. However, it was obvious that the blood-red mist restriction was only temporary. After all, apart from when it invaded a certain world cluster or a certain wandering cultivator, the blood-red mist was growing and strengthening at every moment. Unknowingly, the blood-red mist had already gained intelligence and was able to sort out its own power. There were also brilliant people among the itinerant cultivators. Very quickly, some of the rogue cultivators noticed this trend. The fact that these individual cultivators had found out about this was a matter that concerned all the individual cultivators on the 4th level of the path to Tao Master. Naturally, he could not keep this a secret. Not long after, he had already publicized this trend to the extent that all the rogue cultivators on the 4th level of the Tao Master's path were aware of it. We can't let it continue to grow. Otherwise, all of us may be devoured by it. This was the final conclusion of many of the rogue cultivators. Such a conclusion made many of the rogue cultivators hate the blood-red mist and feel a headache at the same time. The strangeness of the blood-red mist was beyond the imagination of all the rogue cultivators. It was clearly just a product condensed from negative emotions. Normally speaking, it should not have any power and should not be able to affect any of them. However, they did not expect that under the blessing of the creation power, the negative emotions would undergo such an incredible evolution. In the end, It had become an enemy that they could not do anything about, and a hidden danger that could destroy all of them. This development had really subverted their worldview, and they did not know how to destroy it for a while. This was also because they were not knowledgeable enough, so they felt that it was strange. If they knew that there was a layer called the universe of negative emotions in the state of chaos, and that even true saints did not dare to enter it easily, and had to rely on the construction of the transportation network that connected the various worlds to travel, they would know that this kind of evolution of the negative emotions and the creation power was really normal. After all, the creation power was originally a kind of power with a large number of characteristics of the state of chaos. Such a power existed here, coupled with a strong enough negative emotion, produced this kind of fundamental transformation, turning this kind of negative emotion into a hidden danger at this time. This was really reasonable. It could even be imagined that if this blood-red mist continued to develop into a universe of negative emotions and completely enveloped the entire fourth level of the Tao Master's path, it would not be impossible for this level to become similar to the universe of negative emotions in the state of chaos. It is condensed from negative emotions. We may be able to reconcile it with positive emotions. This was a solution that many rogue cultivators came up with after various discussions. After all, the existence of negative emotions and positive emotions was completely opposite. If there was too strong a negative emotion, as long as corresponding positive emotions were added to it, it could become normal. Similarly, no matter how strong the positive emotion was, the positive emotion would be offset by the corresponding negative emotion. For example, if an ordinary person won a big prize of tens of millions of yuan, he would naturally have a strong positive emotion that was even strong enough to make the heart of a relatively weak person collapse. However, if at the same time he was told that he had a terminal illness, that he could not spend all the money, and that he might die, this would inevitably make him have a stronger negative emotion. When these two factors were superimposed, the previous positive emotion that had been generated because of the big prize would naturally disappear without a trace. This basic principle was known even by ordinary people, let alone these rogue cultivators who had cultivated to the fourth level of the Tao Master's path. Naturally, they were more clear about it. In fact, they had a deeper understanding of this than ordinary people. They had an almost perfect understanding and control of how much positive emotion to use and what kind of positive emotion to use. For example, if it was also an ordinary person who won a big prize, they would use negative emotions to neutralize the positive emotions generated by the prize. However, they would not tell him that he had a terminal illness, which was the biggest source of negative emotions, to completely suppress the positive emotions or even cause a rebound. They would definitely choose one very precisely, such as the negative emotion of their wife having an affair, to accurately neutralize the positive emotion. In the end, the positive emotion would completely disappear without causing any backlash, so that the ordinary person would not be too happy, but would not be too sad either, because they had such a deep understanding of the principle of neutralization. When these rogue cultivators thought of this method at this time, they were all confident that this method would definitely succeed and would definitely be able to completely neutralize the blood-red smoke. It was precisely because of this confidence that this method was quickly adopted by many rogue cultivators after it came up. Immediately, countless rogue cultivators began to communicate with each other, creating a method to condense positive emotions and spreading it to countless rogue cultivators in countless worlds. At the same time, this method was spread to many itinerant cultivators. What kind of positive emotions did each itinerant cultivator need to condense? How many positive emotions did they need to condense? How to combine these positive emotions, and how to combine this combination with other itinerant cultivators' combinations. Just like that, this step alone was already so complicated that even a false saint might not be able to do it perfectly. However, it was obvious that this was not a problem for many experts who had undergone the fourth tribulation here. In just a few days, they had completely mastered this method. All rogue cultivators had already obtained a combination of positive emotions and were ready to start the final combination to completely neutralize the blood-red smoke. The blood-red smoke did not enter any world group in these days, nor did it affect any rogue cultivators. Therefore, compared to a few days ago, there was not much change. At least, it did not exceed the rogue cultivators' expectations. In other words, it was still within the range of the various countermeasures that the rogue cultivators had originally prepared. Under such circumstances, after countless confirmations, the rogue cultivators finally breathed a sigh of relief and decided to continue using the method that they had originally discussed. "Hurry up, it's almost at my world group," a rogue cultivator shouted at this time, his voice filled with inexplicable panic. Not far away from him, the blood-red smoke was already surging, slowly creeping towards his world group. The expressions of the other rogue cultivators turned solemn when they heard his words. Apart from the rogue cultivator who was about to face danger, many other rogue cultivators did not care much about the impending doom of the rogue cultivator, as long as it did not affect them. Even if all the rogue cultivators on the 4th level of the Tao Master's Path died, it would not affect them. However, even if they did not care about this, these rogue cultivators could not sit back and watch the blood-red smoke pour into the world group. After all, if the blood-red smoke entered the world group, its nature would definitely change. At that time, wouldn't all the preparations that they had made before be completely useless? Wouldn't they have to start all over again? Wouldn't all of them be in danger of being affected by the blood-red smoke? With this understanding, it could not be more obvious what they would do. In an instant, the avatars formed from the positive emotions of the rogue cultivators quickly shot towards the blood-red smoke from all directions. After so many years, the rogue cultivators' understanding of the nature of the creation power had become quite profound. Naturally, they also knew that the time attribute within the creation power did not have much connection with the outside world. Therefore, at this time, the combination of their positive emotions that they had condensed with the help of the unique time attribute within the creation power. In a flash, they had already penetrated the endless creation power, almost as if they did not need to experience time, and had already appeared around the blood-red smoke at the same time. Although the blood-red smoke had developed for such a long time, it was still developing according to its own instincts. How could it compare to the product that the rogue cultivators had actively condensed? At this moment, before the combination of the positive emotions truly came into contact with the blood-red smoke, the countless combinations had already fused together and formed a complete circle around the blood-red smoke, directly enveloping it within. Due to the contact, the countless combinations of the positive emotions began to produce an extremely intense reaction. Amidst the intense reaction, the countless positive emotions fused, complemented each other, and strengthened each other. In the end, they fused into one at an unimaginable speed, forming a faint blue smoke. The faint blue smoke gave off a completely different feeling compared to the blood-red smoke formed by the combination of negative emotions. The blood-red smoke gave off an extremely uncomfortable feeling. Looking at it was like listening to countless people expressing their regrets, pain, anger, hatred, and sorrow. Anyone who saw this light blue smoke would feel a positive emotion welling up in their hearts. It was as if countless people were talking about their joy, their excitement, their pride, their kinship, their friendship, and their love. When these two different existences came into contact with each other, an earth-shattering change occurred in an instant. When the blood-red smoke and the blue smoke came into contact, endless terrifying shockwaves spread out continuously. The Genesis energy was frantically devoured and changed during this process. Then, it was carried by the shockwaves and scattered in all directions. In the end, it crashed into the Genesis energy, collapsed, and disappeared. During this process, both the blood-red smoke and the faint blue smoke were constantly being consumed. It was as if they were undergoing the neutralization that the rogue cultivators had expected. Success? When the rogue cultivators sensed this, their hearts were filled with inexplicable joy and excitement. They all felt as if a heavy burden had been lifted from their shoulders. As long as this plan succeeded, they would no longer have to worry about the danger that the blood-red smoke formed by the negative emotions would bring them. From now on, they would be able to cultivate independently and safely for a long time. They would no longer have to worry about any external forces affecting their cultivation. Just as the rogue cultivators were secretly rejoicing, a strange existence suddenly appeared out of nowhere in the blood-red smoke and the faint blue smoke. Chapter 22:51. Between the blood-red mist and the faint blue mist, there was an extremely strange gray mist. As soon as the gray mist appeared, it instantly suppressed the impact from the collision between the blood-red mist and the faint blue mist. It was as if a huge hand had instantly pressed down on two jumping ants on the ground. In that instant, the shockwaves that were constantly being released in all directions froze in an instant. Then, the shockwaves bounced back, and as if they were being pulled by a black hole, they charged madly towards the gray smoke, disappearing into it in the blink of an eye. Even a shockwave that was sent so far away was like this, not to mention the reaction of the light blue and blood-red smoke that was closer to the explosion. In an instant, when the numerous attacks charged towards the gray smoke, more than half of the pale blue smoke and the blood-red smoke had already been devoured by the gray smoke. After devouring the two mists that made up its body, the gray mist began to expand at a crazy speed. From its original state of strands, it had expanded to the size of the blood-red mist and the faint blue mist in the blink of an eye. As it grew to this stage, the attractive force within it had also increased by countless times. In the blink of an eye, it had devoured all of the blood-red mist and the faint blue mist. What's going on? Why is there such a strange thing? The itinerant cultivators roared in shock and bewilderment. Among them, the most frantic and fearful one was none other than the owner of the world cluster that was not far away from the gray mist. At this moment, the gray mist had already devoured all the smoke and impact. However, even under such circumstances, the gray mist did not stop. Instead, it began to madly shoot forward in the direction that the blood-red mist was originally moving in. In the blink of an eye, it had already crossed the range of the world creation energy and arrived before the world group. It crashed into it and began to devour everything within the world group. It even devoured all the living beings within, including the rogue cultivator. Facing the terrifying devouring force, the itinerant cultivator was indescribably terrified. As he struggled, he screamed with all his might. The screams were indescribably mournful, causing the other itinerant cultivator's hair to stand on end. They felt as if the end of the world had arrived. It's countless times stronger than before. This was the judgment that the itinerant cultivators made when they saw the devouring force of the gray mist. Perhaps we've done something that will make us regret it. At this moment, the itinerant cultivators murmured with fear in their eyes. Although they were confident, they did not think that they could easily get rid of the wandering cultivator who was now screaming miserably. The fact that the gray mist could get rid of the itinerant cultivator so easily meant that they wouldn't be able to put up much resistance against it. In fact, they might even be weaker than the itinerant cultivator. Under such circumstances, when they saw the smoke devouring the world and the rogue cultivator, they were naturally worried if they would also be devoured by the smoke in the following period of time. Their hearts were filled with terror at the thought of this outcome. Each of them felt an indescribable fear. "What should we do now?" one of the itinerant cultivators murmured. Following his words, everyone fell silent. This silence was because everyone was at their wits' end. They planned to stop talking, stop lamenting, and stop feeling afraid, and wait for someone else to come up with a solution. The appearance of this silence made all the itinerant cultivators feel even more despair. This meant that none of the itinerant cultivators could think of a way to deal with the gray mist. Faced with this situation, the itinerant cultivators were all stunned. A feeling of despair began to rise in the hearts of the itinerant cultivators. This feeling of despair was a negative emotion to begin with. After it appeared, it was transmitted to the gray smoke through some mysterious channel, causing the gray smoke to grow continuously in the process. As it grew stronger, it devoured the world group and the itinerant cultivators, becoming stronger and more terrifying. As it grew stronger, it made the itinerant cultivators feel even more despair, causing the gray mist to be replenished even more. Just like that, it formed an endless cycle. Now, there's only one way, one of the itinerant cultivators said at some point in time. In this absolutely silent and oppressive atmosphere, although the itinerant cultivator was only trying to suggest a solution and didn't make a loud announcement, it was enough to attract the attention of all the other itinerant cultivators. This was because all the itinerant cultivators shifted their attention from the gray mist to the itinerant cultivator who spoke. The negative emotions that were constantly appearing in their hearts naturally began to dissipate. On the contrary, even though they hadn't heard what the solution was, they couldn't help but feel a strong sense of hope in their hearts. And this hope was obviously a positive emotion. Just one sentence was enough to turn despair into hope. It was easy to imagine how chaotic the itinerant cultivator's emotions were right now. However, at this moment, the positive emotions still couldn't escape the fate of being transmitted to the gray mist through the mysterious channel. They were devoured by the gray mist and became the gray mist's nourishment. Don't forget, in addition to the blood-red smoke formed by negative emotions, there was also the light blue smoke formed by positive emotions. The basic composition of these two types of mist caused both positive and negative emotions to become the gray mist's nourishment, becoming existences that could be devoured by the gray mist. It was precisely because of this that at this moment, regardless of whether the itinerant cultivators were happy or sad, hopeful or despairing, they couldn't change the fact that the gray mist was growing at every moment. It could be predicted that if this continued, the gray mist would grow completely after a period of time and turn into a strange universe. A strange universe that was formed from both positive and negative emotions. The different emotions of the itinerant cultivators, whether there were more negative or more positive emotions, would at most affect which emotion would eventually gain the upper hand in the strange universe that would eventually take shape. It wouldn't be able to change the shape of the strange universe. However, this was clearly not what the itinerant cultivators were concerned about. What they were concerned about was the only way to solve the problem that the rogue cultivator had mentioned. If we can't handle it ourselves, then we can only ask for help, the itinerant cultivator said with a complicated expression. He wasn't sure when he said this. One could easily hear the hesitation in his voice. It was as if he also thought that the possibility of this solution succeeding was not very high. The other itinerant cultivators felt like they were struck by lightning when they heard his words. Ask for help. Ask him for help. This thought echoed in their minds. Although the itinerant cultivator didn't say who he was asking for help for, none of the itinerant cultivators were stupid. How could they not know that there could only be one person they were asking for help for? That person was the powerful being who had created the river of creation and caused the entire itinerant cultivator territory to be engulfed by the power of creation. In the end, many of the itinerant cultivators died because they weren't familiar with the power of creation. He was an itinerant cultivator who seemed to have come from a higher level. There was not a single person among them who did not fear that powerful existence. After so many years, they had benefited greatly from the means of that powerful being, which allowed them to own their own world group and start their real cultivation on the 4th level of the Tao Master's path. However, they had already seen clearly that the expert was nothing to them. He was only doing this to achieve some ulterior motive. Under such circumstances, how could they not be afraid of that expert? Even the most open-minded person could clearly see the huge vortex formed by countless world group in the center of the 4th level of the Tao Master's path. The existence of the huge vortex represented that the expert was carrying out some unimaginable plan or even conspiracy. Under such circumstances, asking them to ask for help from that expert was like asking a chef for help from a fish on the chopping board. No matter how they thought about it, they couldn't accept such a situation easily. Due to these complicated emotions, all the rogue cultivators fell into a dilemma after hearing the rogue cultivator's suggestion. Silence once again shrouded the entire 4th level of the Tao Master's path. However, compared to the previous silence that was filled with despair, the current silence lacked that feeling of despair. Of course, although there was less despair, the other emotions were still endless. pain, hesitation, doubt, displeasure, anger, fear, helplessness in the end, through all kinds of subtle and mysterious channels. These emotions directly penetrated the power of creation, penetrated all barriers, and were injected into the gray smoke. Abruptly and soundlessly, the world cluster was devoured by the gray smoke. Even the owner of the world group, the itinerant cultivator, was completely submerged in the gray smoke. He became an insignificant, tiny black, drifting aimlessly inside the gray smoke. This situation clearly showed that the itinerant cultivator had been completely usurped by the gray smoke and had completely dedicated himself to the smoke. After that, the gray smoke had no intention of stopping at all. Instead, it rushed straight in another direction. It wasn't a direction that was empty, but a direction that led to another world group of itinerant cultivators. This situation was obviously completely different from the blood-red smoke. The blood-red smoke that was derived from negative emotions moved in random directions. Unless it gathered very close, it wouldn't be attracted by any world group or any itinerant cultivator. In contrast, the behavior of the gray smoke had proved that it was more dangerous and difficult to resist than the blood-red smoke. In the face of this situation, the panic in the hearts of the itinerant cultivators finally reached a certain limit, completely suppressing the various conflicts that originally existed in their hearts. They finally made up their minds to ask for help from the expert with ulterior motives. "Damn it! Hurry up! Hurry up! It's coming for me!" Among them, the desperate roar of an itinerant cultivator that made even the itinerant cultivators shiver after hearing it gave them enough motivation to really make a decision. Although they had already made the decision to ask for help, they still had to think about how to ask for help. After all, the expert was inside the incomparably huge vortex in the center of the fourth level, and he wasn't directly in front of them. The other party wouldn't respond as long as they shouted loudly. If they wanted to ask for help, they would need to put in a lot of effort. As for whether that expert would save them or not, they didn't have much to worry about. After all, the various arrangements and plans of that expert clearly weren't just for the sake of watching them die. Clearly, it was for the sake of seeing that they would be able to bring corresponding benefits to that expert during this process. Under such circumstances, it was obviously not in their interest to be completely devoured by the gray smoke. Therefore, they believed that the powerhouse would definitely save them. As for whether he could save them or not, they were even less worried. All the itinerant cultivators knew how powerful the barrier between the domain of the Down Master and the domain of the itinerant cultivators was. But now, even such a powerful barrier was so easily destroyed by that expert. One could only imagine how powerful that expert was. Although the gray smoke was terrifying, it was definitely not as powerful as the barrier that separated the Down Master's domain and the Rogue Cultivator's domain. Since the expert could easily get rid of the barrier, he could naturally get rid of the gray smoke and save all of them. Chapter 2252. At this moment, the itinerant cultivators quickly took action after a discussion. They gathered their strength and blasted it towards the vortex in the center from all directions. The surges of energy contained their strongest wills and their greatest pleas. In an instant, they had already penetrated the boundless creation energy and collided with the huge vortex. It was a pity that this strength was insignificant compared to the vortex. One must know that the vortex was a huge vortex that enveloped countless worlds. The amount of creation energy contained in such an existence was unimaginable to ordinary itinerant cultivators. The terrifying power of creation itself was already the most powerful defense. Currently, Luo Fan was completely immersed in comprehending the light of heaven and earth and did not pay any attention to the outside world at all. In this way, how could the impact of the power that could not even shake the entire vortex attract his attention? When the itinerant cultivators saw that their strength was like a clay ox entering the sea and did not cause any disturbance, and the powerhouse inside did not react to it at all, they could not help but feel a growing sense of fear. They were originally wondering if they should seek help from the powerhouse, But they did not expect that the powerhouse would not be in the mood to care about them now that they had made up their minds. They couldn't help but feel that their previous worries were groundless. Facing such a change, the fear in the itinerant cultivators' hearts grew stronger. In particular, the itinerant cultivator who was extremely terrified earlier was now engulfed by the gray smoke. His world group was almost completely devoured by the gray smoke, and his body was gradually submerged in the gray smoke. When he stood side by side with the itinerant cultivator that was devoured before, the fear and despair became even more intense and intense. What should we do now? The itinerant cultivators mumbled with fear in their eyes. Attack again. A itinerant cultivator gritted his teeth and roared. With this roar, he took the initiative to gather the strongest power and might that he could release and directly blasted it towards the vortex in the center, which was where Luo Fan's world group was located. This attack had clearly surpassed ordinary creation energy. If it were to strike any other itinerant cultivator's world group, it would definitely cause a huge impact on the world group. The world group would not be able to withstand the attack and would suffer visible damage. However, at this moment, when the attack charged into the vortex, it did not even cause any disturbance to the vortex itself. The vortex easily twisted and devoured it completely. Seeing this, the itinerant cultivator was not discouraged at all, or rather, he became even more frenzied. The power around him surged as he controlled the world group to release some kind of power that fused with his own power and blasted it towards the vortex in the center. At this moment, the other itinerant cultivators also seemed to have woken up from a dream. That's right, our attacks might seem very powerful to us, but to that powerhouse, our attacks are nothing. Even if we attack with our full strength, we might not be able to sense it. How can we show mercy and not use our full strength? Immediately, more and more itinerant cultivators joined the group of itinerant cultivators who attacked first. They began to gather their strongest power and might, and even the subtle power abstracted from the world group they had formed, and blasted it towards the vortex in the center. However, no matter how many times they attacked, no matter how fast they attacked, they did not cause any ripples on the vortex. When all the attacks rushed into the vortex, they were easily crushed by the endless power of creation above the vortex. The attacks were turned into countless fragments and completely integrated into the power of creation. In the end, they disappeared without a trace, as if they had never appeared. Faced with such a situation, the itinerant cultivators were panicking and in despair, but they did not dare to slow down. Instead, they stimulated their power and power to extract the power that belonged to the cluster of worlds that they had comprehended recently and added it to their attacks. They sent their power towards the vortex in the center and bombarded it. As time went by, more and more itinerant cultivators joined the group. The vortex in the center looked like it was emitting countless beams of light, and the whole appearance had changed. Of course, this was only at a glance. If one took a closer look, they would find that it was not the vortex that was emitting light, but the countless beams of light that were shooting into the vortex. At the same time as the itinerant cultivators, the gray smoke that was constantly wreaking havoc in the fourth level of the Tao Master's path was also moving. Every few hours, the gray smoke would devour a world group and completely devour an itinerant cultivator. As for itself, as it devoured, every few hours it would leap and grow explosively. It had only been a few days since the beginning, but it had grown many times. It could originally only pierce into a world group like a sharp thorn, but now it could even devour an entire world group like a python. This speed of growth made the itinerant cultivators feel almost completely hopeless. And this despair once again turned into the growth of the gray smoke, causing it to grow faster and faster, making it even more of a deterrent to the itinerant cultivators. Now, all the itinerant cultivators were already doing their best to move their world groups away from the gray smoke, wanting to escape from it. Some itinerant cultivators who were closer to the gray smoke even directly abandoned their world groups and moved towards other itinerant cultivators' world groups, wanting to enter them to escape from the disaster of the gray smoke. Of course, this was obviously an extremely stupid decision. After all, ever since the world groups were established, they were already closely related to their past. For them, the damage to the world groups was equivalent to the damage to their past. In the end, once the world groups were destroyed, they would also suffer extremely terrifying damage. Even if their bodies seemed unharmed, their consciousness and life source would be almost completely annihilated. In this way, the itinerant cultivators hiding in other cultivators' world groups would only be left as walking corpses. If the existence that took in the itinerant cultivator was ruthless, it could even directly seize everything from the itinerant cultivator and turn his body into a puppet. However, it was clear that these rogue cultivators would normally be interested in this. They would be interested in strengthening their own strength and techniques. However, at this time, their own lives were under great threat, and this kind of growth was not beneficial to them at all. Obviously, they would not have such thoughts at this time. Even if there were many good materials for refining puppets in front of them, they simply ignored them and poured all their energy, wisdom, and abilities into attacking the vortex in the center. They did everything they could to stir up the whirlpool. They wanted the supreme expert in the depths of the whirlpool to discover their dangerous situation and save them. It could be said that after such a long time, this hope had almost turned into their faith. Damn it, why can't the world groups be moved from their roots? Some itinerant cultivators cried out in extreme pain. These were the itinerant cultivators who were already targeted by the gray smoke and could be completely devoured by it in the next instant. Ever since the world groups were created, they had been fixed in place and could not be moved. Even if one used all sorts of special methods and cultivated all sorts of indescribable cultivation methods to move the world cluster slightly, there is still a great limit to how much one could do. Moreover, the techniques and power required were not things that itinerant cultivators could achieve. Given the itinerant cultivators' current understanding of the world groups, not many of them could even project the world groups, let alone abstract the power of the world groups from the world groups. How could they even hope to move the world groups away from the threat of the gray smoke? Following this almost despairing roar, what followed was their incomparably painful screams. Clearly, their predictions were correct. The gray smoke quickly pounced on them and devoured their world groups, causing their world groups to be rapidly corroded by the gray smoke. At the same time, the itinerant cultivators were also being corroded by the gray smoke. The threat of death was an incomparably powerful stimulus for any cultivator. However, this stimulus had a certain effect on stimulating one's potential. Of course, this was only for a small portion of the cultivators. For most of the cultivators, every step they took at this stage was already breaking their limits and trying their best to reshape their limits. Stimulating one's potential was almost impossible for them. Therefore, to them, the threat of death could only bring them pain. Only a small portion of cultivators, due to certain previous understandings and inspirations, had molded their potential to be stronger than their current realm. In other words, they had molded their limits to be stronger than they were now. Under such circumstances, the threat of death was like stimulating their potential, causing their progress to be many times faster than usual. Due to this difference, the attacks of the many itinerant cultivators attacking the vortex of the creation force at the center began to subconsciously differ. In the end, the itinerant cultivators who could stimulate their potential in the face of death gradually stood out. Their attacks gradually gained the upper hand against the attacks of the many itinerant cultivators. They gradually became the most eye-catching part of all the attacks. At their level, any improvement in their realm would bring about an earth-shattering increase in their strength. At this moment, the effects of the itinerant cultivators who stood out on the vortex of the creation force finally began to appear. Along with their attacks, faint ripples gradually appeared on the vortex. Although the ripples were faint and weak and could not even reach the depths of the vortex, they were captured by Luo Fan's world cluster and sensed by him. However, compared to before, when there was no reaction at all, this was already many times stronger. The itinerant cultivators had placed all their hopes on the vortex. Although the change was small, it did not escape the senses of the itinerant cultivators. At this moment, the itinerant cultivators quickly understood what they should do. At this moment, the itinerant cultivators, who were much stronger than ordinary itinerant cultivators, began to consciously cooperate. Their attacks gradually intertwined in the void, complementing each other and promoting each other. In the end, with attacks that were many times stronger than before, they brazenly smashed into the vortex, causing more ripples than before. The appearance of the ripples gave the other itinerant cultivators even more hope. They began to give up on their original independence and completely adjusted their attacks to the same state as the attacks of the itinerant cultivators, who still had their potential stimulated in the face of life and death. They tried their best to cooperate with the attacks and used all their efforts to help the attacks to slightly increase the impact of their attacks. Under such circumstances, the vortex that was originally filled with countless rays of light in all directions began to change its shape. From the countless rays of light, it turned into a beam of light that was countless times larger than before, and it directly pierced into the depths of the vortex from one direction. Many itinerant cultivators had different paths of cultivation, and their world clusters were worlds apart. They were abstracted from the world clusters, and the power of the world clusters had their own characteristics. The attacks that were triggered from their own paths of cultivation also had their own mysteries. Under such circumstances, it was obviously extremely difficult to perfectly combine all of their attacks and reduce the conflict between their attacks to a negligible state. As a result, they spent tens of thousands of waves of attacks before they barely managed to unify all of their attacks. Only then did they barely manage to combine all of their attacks into one, surpassing the combined effect of their scattered attacks on the whirlpool. At this moment, an unprecedented ripple finally appeared on the vortex. It was the size of a world cluster, but compared to the entire vortex, it was still an extremely insignificant ripple. The appearance of this ripple instantly caused the entire whirlpool to tremble slightly. Chapter 2253. It's a success. At this moment, all the itinerant cultivators could not help but have this thought. What came with this thought was an indescribable sense of relief. It was as if he had finally grasped a strand of hope that fell from the sky in the midst of extreme despair. However, even at this point, not a single one of them dared to do nothing and just wait. Instead, they hurriedly sent waves of cries for help towards the vortex through various methods. In the blink of an eye, all of them entered the vortex. This situation seemed to be very similar to the first action they took at the beginning, but they believed that the current situation must be completely different from before. Sure enough, just as they transmitted their thoughts over, they sensed that the supreme gaze seemed to change slightly. Then, the vortex trembled slightly, and a figure, an extremely tall and sacred figure in the eyes of countless itinerant cultivators, slowly walked out from the center of the vortex. It's really a success. At this time, the itinerant cultivators really confirmed this fact, and all of them looked relaxed. Of course, not all of them could relax. Those itinerant cultivators who were now suffering from the engulfment of the gray smoke could not completely relax like the other itinerant cultivators. After all, the reason why they could still hold on now was that they did not relax, and they were doing their best to resist. If they were to relax like this, what awaited them would probably be the entire world group, their entire bodies, their entire minds, and everything else would be completely engulfed by the gray smoke. To actually create such a thing, should I say that you guys are lucky or unlucky? The figure murmured at this time. Although his voice was not loud, it had spread throughout the entire fourth level of the down master path in the blink of an eye, and into the ears of all the itinerant cultivators on the fourth level, making them feel like they were looking up to a great mountain. It was as if this person did not even need to do anything, and only needed to turn his eyes slightly to be able to completely erase all of them. This strong feeling was not illusory at all, and it made them feel a chill from the bottom of their hearts at this moment. However, what was different from before was that this chill did not bring them fear. It brought them a sense of security. This figure was none other than Luo Fan. In the past, Luo Fan's strength would only make them feel that they were so insignificant in front of him. They felt that if they encountered him, they wouldn't be able to resist at all and would definitely be completely destroyed in the first place. But now, as the person they were asking for help, the more powerful Luo fan was, the more confident they would be in winning against the threat of the gray smoke. Naturally, they felt more secure. However, at this moment, Luo fan did not care about how these rogue cultivators felt. At this time, he just cast his eyes on the gray smoke that was constantly wreaking havoc on the fourth level of the Tao Master's path. With his knowledge, he naturally discovered that the gray smoke was actually the same kind of existence as the universe of negative emotions. It was even to the extent that he could be said to be the initial form of the universe of negative emotions. As long as the corresponding cultivation was carried out and the gray smoke absorbed the corresponding negative emotions in the process of growing, it would naturally evolve into a universe of negative emotions that was parallel to the state of chaos and a layer of the state of chaos. Of course, if it was placed on the fourth level of the Tao Master's path, it would grow into a universe of negative emotions parallel to the fourth level of the Tao Master's path. Once this universe of negative emotions was formed, all living beings on the fourth level of the Tao Master's path might be swallowed by it at any time and thrown into that universe. In fact, it might even completely replace the Genesis energy in the fourth level, causing all the cultivators who entered the fourth level to be thrown into the universe at the first possible moment. They would sink into the countless negative emotions, never to be reincarnated, forever sinking into oblivion. Perhaps this is not bad. Using the universe of negative emotions as a place for cultivation and replacing the structure of the creation power with the structure of a universe of negative emotions seems to be a good choice. Luo Fan thought for a while and suddenly felt that such a change was somewhat inexplicable. After all, although the universe of negative emotions was an extremely harsh environment for living beings, and living beings who were thrown into it would fall into extremely miserable torture. However, it did not mean that they could not cultivate. Perhaps, because of such a harsh environment, it could instead allow cultivators to comprehend the various mysteries needed for cultivation faster and more quickly. In this way, it seemed that it was not unacceptable for cultivators to cultivate and improve in such an environment. Anyway, as long as they raised to a certain level and completed a certain requirement, they would naturally be able to ascend to the fifth level and directly escape from this eternal environment of never being reincarnated and forever sinking. In contrast, compared to the situation where the creation power permeated the entire fourth level, there seemed to be no essential difference. At most, there was only a slight difference in the performance of the situation. Perhaps at that time, the entire Tao Master's path will undergo some kind of adjustment. In this case, it seems that I can try to change the Tao Master's path and achieve the achievements that those under the Tao Master's path have achieved in the previous levels. Such thoughts flashed through Luo Fan's mind. An increasingly strong impulse brewed in his heart and gradually emerged. However, in the end, after a while, he finally suppressed this impulse. The speculation that he had just had was completely based on an illusion. Whether this speculation could really be realized, whether the universe of negative emotions could really replace the structure of the creation power, all of this was still just a fantasy to him. Under such circumstances, all of his efforts might end up in vain. The universe of negative emotions might not be able to replace the structure of the creation power at all. Naturally, it did not matter to him if this kind of effort turned into a bubble. He would not feel that it was a big blow, nor would he feel that such a loss was serious. However, one should not forget that in order to cultivate this wisp of gray smoke into a universe of negative emotions, there was a prerequisite. In order to cultivate this gray smoke into a universe of negative emotions, the gray smoke needed to grow tremendously. It needed to be filled with all the cultivators and all the world clusters that currently existed in the fourth level of the Tao Master's path. Except for him, even if this step was achieved, it was unlikely that the result would be achieved immediately. He still needed to wait here, wait for several times more cultivators to ascend and enter the fourth level. then there would be a trace of a possibility of truly cultivating it into a universe of negative emotions. With such a huge sacrifice, even Luo Fan would not easily make such a decision. In particular, in a situation where the ultimate goal was still unclear and he had no confidence in whether his expectations could be achieved, it was even more impossible for him to make such a sacrifice. After suppressing this impulse, he sighed and his figure shook. In the blink of an eye, he had already crossed the barrier of the endless creation power and directly arrived in front of the gray smoke. He floated in front of it, and in the next moment, the gray smoke would completely drown and devour him. At this moment, the gray smoke had already gained a lot of instincts. Facing Luo Fan, it took action in an instant. It did not pounce forward and devour Luo Fan, but dodged. The gray smoke turned and directly turned in another direction, quickly moving away from Luo Fan. It was as if it had turned into a weak rabbit and was facing a ferocious tiger that had just walked out of the forest. Compared to the crazy, domineering, and reckless behavior it had displayed before the crowd of rogue cultivators, there is a world of difference between this and the past. Seeing this scene, even if the rogue cultivators already knew how terrifying Luo Fan was, even if they were sure that Luo Fan was their savior, they could not help but be dumbfounded and could not believe what they saw. Was this the terrifying smoke that forced them to give up their dignity and ask for help? Why did it look like a weak smoke that could be blown away by the wind? Want to leave? Luo Fan frowned slightly at this moment and said. With that, he waved his hand, and a ray of light instantly shot out from his hand. In a flash, it had already surpassed the power of creation, and it directly enveloped the entire gray smoke, causing it to be completely enveloped by the light. At the moment the light emerged, all the rogue cultivators on the entire fourth level of the Down Master's path could not help but exclaim. This was not because they were shocked by Luo Fan's means. Rather, they did not expect this light to be so powerful. At this moment, their eyes and senses, which were closely watching Luo Fan's actions, were all stung by this light. In fact, many rogue cultivators even felt that their souls were filled with this light. Even their souls were constantly being burned by this light, and they felt a constant stinging pain that was getting more and more intense and terrifying. Fortunately, they quickly closed their eyes and withdrew their senses. The light that entered their souls was like water without a source, a tree without roots. As they fought back with all their might, the light's influence on them began to weaken. Although it did not immediately disappear, it was finally showing signs of doing so. Luo Fan naturally did not care about all of this. At this moment, he only manipulated the light of heaven and earth that he had worked hard to cultivate to envelop the gray smoke. The light of heaven and earth had reincarnated and grown in the world cluster time and time again, and had long grown to a certain bottleneck. At this moment, the light of heaven and earth had reached an indescribable peak. It was so powerful that it had far surpassed what Senior Sister May, the middle-aged man, and even the waxen middle-aged man could produce back then. However, the most important thing about the light of heaven and earth, which was the will of heaven and earth, was still not fully formed. At this moment, the terrifying light of heaven and earth contained only a spiritual aura at the level of the will of heaven and earth. Although this spiritual aura was already extremely powerful and had reached the peak that a spiritual aura could reach, and was only a step away from becoming the true will of heaven and earth, it was still a spiritual aura after all, and had not reached the level of the will of heaven and earth. It seemed that there was still an invisible and untouchable gap between the spiritual aura and the will of heaven and earth. However, no matter how far the spiritual aura was from the will of heaven and earth, the power of the light of heaven and earth was not reduced at all. At this moment, the gray mist that could devour the world cluster was as weak as ordinary mist in the face of the light of heaven and earth. Even though it had controlled the power absorbed from thousands of worlds, and even though it had controlled the power of thousands of independent cultivators to struggle, it was still so insignificant in the face of the light of heaven and earth. The light of heaven and earth did not even need to gather any power. Just its existence alone was enough to suppress the gray mist, and the gray mist could not even make the light of heaven and earth tremble. With a thought, Luo Fan raised his hand and clenched his fist, and the light of heaven and earth began to slowly shrink. The gray mist that was enveloped by the light of heaven and earth began to shrink at the same rhythm as the light of heaven and earth suppressed it. Not long after, when Luo Fan's light of heaven and earth gathered into a sphere with a diameter of 3 meters, the gray mist had also shrunk into a small, thumb-sized, pitch-black stone within the sphere. It's absorbed enough power indeed. Luo Fan sighed as he looked at the stone. He raised his hand and reached into the light that was formed by the light of heaven and earth, which was billions of times more dazzling than the sun. He completely ignored the power that the light had that could suppress everything, and reached the deepest part of it with ease, grabbing the thumb-sized, pitch-black stone. The stone felt extremely cold to touch, as if it was the coldest thing in the chaos. Even if it was Luo Fan, the moment he touched this stone, the feeling of his fingers being frozen emerged from the bottom of his heart. Fortunately, he was within the range of the light of heaven and earth after all. Hence, even though it was so cold, he only needed a thought to use the power of the light of heaven and earth to completely dispel it, allowing his body and mind to be completely isolated from the stone's power. With a thought, the incomparably dazzling light of heaven and earth began to slowly retract. In the end, only a thin layer was left covering the stone. The rest of the light returned to his body, in a state where it seemed to exist but not exist. Although it was only a thin layer of light of heaven and earth, its light was still extremely dazzling. None of the independent cultivators could see what exactly the stone that was enveloped by the light looked like. In other words, there was no way to see what the gray smoke looked like inside. Chapter 2254. To the light of heaven and earth, only the power that it possessed and the complete will of the universe could be considered complete. Once it was complete, the light of heaven and earth would naturally be able to transform into anything. It could be big or small, strong or weak, visible or hidden. It was almost omnipotent and omnipotent. As long as any one of them was missing, there would naturally be a huge deficiency in terms of function. Just like the light of heaven and earth that Luo Fan had condensed, the power of the light of heaven and earth had already reached an unimaginable level. However, because the will of the universe that it possessed had yet to take form and was still at the stage of spirituality, the light itself could not transform endlessly and be omnipotent like the real light of heaven and earth. The fact that the light could be visible but not hidden was a manifestation of this deficiency. If the light of heaven and earth's will had already reached the level of the universe's will, with a single thought from Luo Fan, the light of heaven and earth would naturally retract its light and even turn into a strange state that was almost like a material object that did not emit any light at all. However, due to the lack of this most crucial transformation, he could not do this at all. He could only allow the light to be in a state where it was at full power and maintain this extremely dazzling state at all times. Apart from him, no other rogue cultivators could see the essence of the light, nor could they see the essence of the stone that was condensed from the gray smoke that was concealed by the thin layer of light. He raised his hand to grab the stone and instantly sensed the various characteristics of the stone. It can already be considered an emotional space-time. At this moment, he made a judgment about the essence of the stone. After being forcefully compressed by the light of heaven and earth, the gray smoke's essence had already undergone some sort of sublimation. It was originally a product derived from a mixture of a wisp of positive and negative emotions, but it had transformed into a state between the emotional universe and the substance of the smoke. This state could be called the emotional space-time state. This emotional space-time had an infinite space within it, and even had its own unique river of time. If ordinary living beings were to enter it, they would feel as if they had entered any other universe or any other world. They would feel as if they had stepped into a whole new world, and they would not notice that it was just a small stone. they wouldn't be able to tell that it was nothing more than the product of a certain combination of emotions. At this time, the proportion of emotions in the emotional space-time was already dominated by negative emotions, causing the entire emotional space-time to lean towards the negative emotional space-time. Such an existence was naturally nothing to Luo Fan, but it could be regarded as a dangerous place for ordinary independent cultivators. Just like the tens of thousands of itinerant cultivators that existed in this place at this moment. To them, the emotional space-time was like a hell that had been created for them. Everything they encountered at every moment was what they didn't want to see the most, what they rejected the most, and what they wanted to get away from the most. A rogue cultivator who felt guilty about a certain matter would see that matter constantly replaying itself in front of him. He could even see that matter constantly developing, constantly magnifying, and finally engulfing him. Those rogue cultivators who had encountered some sort of regret would also find that the regret kept flashing in front of them. Every time it happened, it would be as exciting and uncomfortable as the first time they experienced it, and so on and so forth, causing all the rogue cultivators to suffer unbearable torment at every moment. And the negative emotions produced by this torment would, in turn, fuse back into the emotional space-time, causing the emotional space-time to evolve further into a negative emotional space-time. As a result, the many rogue cultivators' encounters became more and more tragic, and their torment became more and more intense. In this way, it formed a vicious cycle. However, this was much better than the state they were in when they were directly engulfed by the gray smoke. When they were engulfed by the gray smoke, their willpower had actually been completely suppressed. They had completely turned into walking corpses. They were only being controlled by the gray smoke, and they were doing everything that the gray smoke needed them to do. Although it was painful, and although every moment was the most intense torment, they still recovered their willpower and broke away from the state of walking corpses. Of course, there might be some rogue cultivators who felt that they would rather be in the state of walking corpses than endure this torment at this moment. In the outside world, many rogue cultivators who had not been affected by the gray smoke had become excited. Even though they didn't know what the gray smoke had become, and even though their eyes were stinging and their souls were being crushed by the afterimages left in their hearts by the light of heaven and earth, the gray smoke's threat to them had finally disappeared. Even if they did not know how the powerhouse would treat them, at least they would not be completely engulfed by the gray smoke. They would live a life worse than death, and would never be able to reincarnate, no matter how they looked at it. This situation was worthy of their excitement and celebration. At this moment, one of the rogue cultivators sent a voice transmission to Luo Fan. "Thank you for your help, Senior. We are extremely grateful." The other rogue cultivators also returned to their senses at this moment. They forcefully suppressed their various negative states and sent voice transmissions to Luo Fan, thanking Luo Fan for saving them from their predicament. Each of their gratitude was more sincere than the last, and each of them was more mushy than the last. They could not wait to make Luo Fan feel embarrassed to deal with them. At this moment, each of them was in great pain. Each of them had endured unbearable torment during the process, and all of them could not wait to find a place to meditate in seclusion. However, none of them dared to express their gratitude to Luo Fan at this moment. None of them dared to show even the slightest bit of insincerity at this moment. There was no other reason than that one of the rogue cultivators had already expressed his gratitude with incomparable sincerity. Comparisons were the worst. If it wasn't for the rogue cultivator's actions, they wouldn't have expressed their gratitude. Naturally, it wouldn't have been too abrupt, and that expert might not have noticed them. However, if a rogue cultivator started to express his gratitude, but they did not take any action, then they would naturally stand out and be noticed by the powerhouse. At that time, if that powerhouse was displeased and directly attacked him, then he would die an unjust death. This kind of worry seemed to be groundless, as if they were worrying too much. However, how could they not think about it when it concerned their own lives? Luo Fan was attracted by so many rogue cultivators. He turned his head and glanced at them. Suddenly, he smiled faintly and said, "There's no need to thank me. Just take it as compensation for what will happen next." Hearing this, the rogue cultivators could not help but feel a sense of foreboding. At this moment, Luo Fan waved his hand, and the light of heaven and earth that had originally covered the emotional space-time was suddenly released. In an instant, it swept across the entire fourth level of the road of Tao Master, covering all the rogue cultivators and all the worlds that existed in the fourth level. It was so thin that it was almost insignificant. If one did not pay close attention, they would have overlooked it at a glance. Only then did the rogue cultivators come to their senses. They were all horrified and shouted, "Senior, what do you mean by this?" Even as they yelled, they did their best to stimulate their world cluster, gathering the power that belonged to their world cluster that they gradually came to understand and charged towards the radiance that engulfed their world cluster and their bodies, doing all they could to tear it apart and regain their freedom. While they did not know what that radiance was, the gray smoke that had left them in despair was as weak as normal smoke, and yet it remained in their memories. Therefore, there was no need to explain how frightening the power of that radiance was. Now that such a light had covered their world group, how could they not panic? Unfortunately, although the light was only a trace of the light that Luo Fan had extracted from the light of heaven and earth, its level had already surpassed the fourth level of the road of Tao Master and the power that had been abstracted from the world group that existed in the fourth level. Therefore, no matter how the rogue cultivators struggled and attacked, they still could not affect the light in the slightest. During the process, the light seemed to be on a different level from the world group. No matter how the power attacked, it did not waver or change in the slightest. In the face of such a situation, the rogue cultivators finally lost all hope and roared in shock and anger. In between these roars of shock and anger, there were even crying, begging for mercy, and surrendering. Even though they were experts who had already passed the four tribulations, their performance in the face of fatal crisis was not much different from that of ordinary people, except for the way they behaved. Naturally, Luo Fan did not care about all this. At this time, he just manipulated the light of heaven and earth to pull these world groups towards the vortex in the center, where his world group was located. For ordinary rogue cultivators, it was naturally an extremely difficult thing to pull and move their own world group. However, for Luo Fan, who had condensed the light of heaven and earth, it was just a matter of whether he wanted to or not. Therefore, from the perspective of the entire fourth level of the road of Tao Master, the countless world groups in the entire fourth level seemed to be attracted by the smoke vortex in the center and began to revolve around it, gradually approaching the vortex. After an unknown period of time, the world groups began to be thrown into the vortex, and then they continued to go deeper into the vortex through the orbit of the vortex. And finally, they were glued to the world groups that were originally glued to Luo Fan's world group. As the Cosmos group was glued to it, the wills of the rogue cultivators were naturally captured by Luo Fan's Cosmos group. They were thrown into the Cosmos group and entered a random world, a time-space reincarnation cycle. At the moment when the wills of the rogue cultivators were about to be thrown into the reincarnation, the despair in their hearts suddenly skyrocketed. Although it was only for a moment, the despair produced in this moment was equivalent to the despair that could only be produced after millions of years. This kind of despair, through some unimaginable channel that even Luo Fan could not understand, was directly transmitted to the small emotional space-time that was still in Luo Fan's hand at this moment, which was covered by the light of heaven and earth, and could not be seen by all the other rogue cultivators. It directly integrated into the emotional space-time, causing the space-time to tremble and suddenly expand a little. In this way, the moment the will of every rogue cultivator was thrown into the reincarnation of a certain world, or a certain space, this situation would occur once. In the beginning, Luo Fan naturally did not notice this change. After all, this change was completely out of his expectations. However, as the number of times increased, as the frequency of the situation increased, no matter how slow he was, he should have gradually discovered this situation. Moreover, The word slow didn't have anything to do with him in the first place. There's actually such a change? He murmured. His eyes flickered, and he directly locked onto the small, emotional space-time in his hand. With the help of the light of heaven and earth, he sensed all the slightest changes that occurred in it. At this moment, the space-time was already several times larger than at the beginning. The originally imperfect laws and principles had also become much more complete. Behind these laws, there was also a strange great Tao that was gradually taking shape. Evidently, this space-time was already turning into a universe of emotions, and a universe of negative emotions had begun to change. This change caused the stone to become much heavier at this moment. Moreover, the light of heaven and earth could also feel the increasingly powerful pressure coming from it. This pressure caused the ball of light in his hand to tremble slightly, and he had no choice but to gather more light of heaven and earth in his hand to wrap around this emotional space-time. This also caused the sun in his hand to become larger and more dazzling. I originally planned to give up, but it seems like there's still a possibility of success now. At this moment, this thought flashed across Luo Fan's mind, and an indescribable excitement appeared in his eyes. Chapter 2255. As Luo Fan changed the way he collected the wills of the itinerant cultivators, the negative emotions that were born from them began to increase continuously. The emotional space-time that was gradually transforming into a universe of negative emotions began to grow at an unimaginable speed. The blood-red smoke at the beginning was formed by the accumulation of regret, guilt, anger, and other negative emotions of the itinerant cultivators. From this, it could be seen how mysterious and powerful the negative emotions of the itinerant cultivators were. Under such circumstances, Luo Fan consciously enhanced their negative emotions, and the impact it caused was naturally far beyond the limits of ordinary people's imagination. As the negative emotional space-time continued to expand, the amount of heaven and earth light that Luo Fan attached to it naturally increased. From afar, it seemed like a sun that was getting bigger, brighter, and more dazzling gradually appeared where Luo Fan was. It was a sun that gradually covered him completely, making it difficult to see him beyond a certain distance. The emotional space-time affected all wills, not only the wills of living beings, but also the wills of heaven and earth. If there was no influence, the predecessor of the emotional space-time would not have been able to devour the countless worlds, and space-time in those worlds. The reason why Luo Fan was not affected by the emotional space-time at this moment was that his heaven and earth light isolated the emotional space-time from him. It seemed like he was directly supporting the emotional space-time, but in fact there was a huge gap between the two of them, isolating them from each other. Compared to Luo Fan, who could stay away from the emotional space-time under the isolation of the heaven and earth light, the heaven and earth light obviously did not have such a good thing. At this moment, it directly came into contact with the emotional space-time, and the spiritual aura that belonged to the will of heaven and earth was constantly affected by the emotional space-time. The reason why it did not show any abnormalities and did not cause any changes to the heaven and earth light was that although the spiritual aura was not the true will of heaven and earth, its quantity had reached an unbelievable level. With the influence of the emotional space-time, it would take an extremely long time to accumulate the influence on the spiritual aura to the point where living beings could sense it. However, this was only the beginning. But now the emotional space-time was growing continuously. In the emotional space-time, things that didn't exist in the emotional space-time, such as the nomological rules, great Tao, and even the will of heaven and earth that belonged to the emotional space-time. In this way, the emotional space-time's influence on the spiritual aura of the worlds will begin to strengthen at an unimaginable speed. Faintly, one could see bits and pieces of faint, gray luster gradually appearing in the light of the world. However, this luster was extremely dim. Under the stimulation of the light of heaven and earth, it quickly disappeared. Even Luo Fan couldn't detect its existence. At this moment, Luo Fan only focused his attention on the emotional space-time. He carefully sensed every tiny change that was produced in the emotional space-time. He sensed the process of the countless nomological rules being born little by little. He sensed every detail of the infinite nomological rules being formed little by little. He also sensed every tiny change in the great Tao that appeared from nothingness. During this process, he felt that his understanding of the emotional space-time was deepening at every moment. He discovered that his sensitivity to emotions was strengthening at every moment. In a trance, he seemed to have become the ruler of the emotional space-time. He was dominating all the changes in the entire emotional space-time and manipulating the formation of the emotional space-time. In a trance, he even felt that his worldview of laws had resurfaced from the depths of his memory. Countless concepts and cognition began to be reflected in the emotional space-time. He began to comprehend the changes in the emotional space-time through his worldview of laws. Through the changes in the emotional space-time, he began to recomprehend the various concepts and cognition in his worldview, as well as the various concepts and abilities that were derived from them. In this transformation, he gradually forgot the passage of time. His entire person seemed to have turned into a comprehending machine. He just blindly repeated the process that he had set up at the beginning. He slowly inserted the will of a rogue cultivator into his own world cluster. At the same time, he constantly comprehended the countless negative emotions that seeped into the emotional space-time, stimulating the emotional space-time to produce all kinds of subtle changes and all kinds of indescribable growth. This process caused his view of the world to undergo an extremely subtle and even imperceptible change at every moment. Or perhaps it could be said that he was growing. His life origin also underwent all kinds of subtle changes during this process. It seemed to become more and more exquisite. The bright spots on it became brighter and brighter. The absolute aura that was revealed from the bright spots became more and more obvious. In contrast, the light of heaven and earth that he emitted that covered the emotional space-time was also constantly strengthening. The light looked brighter and brighter. It was getting hotter and hotter. And in a place that Luo Fan did not notice, where the light of heaven and earth came into contact with the emotional space-time, there were layers of gray constantly appearing and disappearing again. Just like that, time continued to flow, and before he knew it, 10 million years had passed. No matter how slow Luo Fan's speed was, 10 million years was enough for him to put all the will of the rogue cultivators into his own world cluster. He also moved all the worlds of the rogue cultivators into the whirlpool, where his world cluster was located through various means and directly glued together with his world cluster. It could be said that compared to the original appearance of countless tiny stars around the whirlpool, the entire fourth level of the Tao Master's path had become extremely empty and there were no more stars. In addition to the central whirlpool, there was only one existence outside the whirlpool. It was a sun that emitted infinite light and illuminated the entire fourth level of the Tao Master's path. It was a sun that no one knew how big it was, but any rogue cultivator who looked at it would feel their eyes burning and feel the shadow of a sun that would never disappear in their hearts. As for what was inside the sun, what was beside the sun, and what kind of substance existed, even if Luo Fan was standing outside, he could no longer see clearly. When the last rogue cultivator was thrown in, the process that was originally set by Luo Fan, which was constantly repeating itself, was instantly interrupted. Luo Fan, who had been immersed in the evolution of the emotional space-time, was forcibly pulled out of his immersion at this moment. Is it over? Such a thought flashed in his mind when he came back to his senses. He swept his perception around, and all the changes in the entire fourth level of the Tao Master's path were already completely within his perception. It's a pity that there are no more rogue cultivators. Looking at the fourth level of the Tao Master's path, which only had the creation power left, he couldn't help but feel a little disappointed. In the past 10 million years, the benefits he had gained were so great that he had not expected it to be. The negative emotion universe could occupy a place in the state of chaos, and even the state of chaos could not be shaken. It needed to be divided into a level to accommodate it. Even the emotional space-time that was born in the fourth level of the Tao Master's Path was not a negative emotion universe that could really exist in the state of chaos. It was definitely not comparable to an ordinary space-time, an ordinary world, or an ordinary universe. It could be said that the negative emotion space-time in front of Luo Fan was not inferior to the big world from a certain point of view, and such an existence had been in his hands for the past 10 million years. It had always been in front of him, allowing him to sense all the changes that existed in it. He had understood all the details that existed in it, and all the fundamental principles of evolution. It was easy to imagine the impact it had on him. It could be said that today, his worldview had made great progress compared to tens of millions of years ago. The result of this was that the power of his divine ability had skyrocketed by at least several times compared to before, but in his eyes, this was just a minor improvement. What he really cared about was that in the process, his understanding of the light of heaven and earth had been further deepened. This deepening made him vaguely understand how his light of heaven and earth could grow from the original spiritual aura to the will of heaven and earth. All kinds of thoughts flashed in his mind, and he suddenly smiled bitterly. The pity in his eyes had disappeared and was replaced by an indescribable joy. But I took it for granted at the beginning. Maybe I should be glad that there are not enough rogue cultivators in the fourth level. He thought in his heart, and the joy on his face became even stronger. However, through the various digesting and recollections just now, he already knew the mistake he had made back then. In other words, he understood what kind of changes had happened to the light of heaven and earth, which he used to resist the emotional space-time, or rather, the emotional space-time that was transforming into a universe of negative emotions. With a slight thought, he carefully sensed his light of heaven and earth, comprehending all the subtle and mysterious aura that the light of heaven and earth exuded, searching for the various subtle pulses within it. At this moment, an incomparably powerful spiritual aura rushed towards him, directly drowning his mind and completely drowning out his previous senses. At first glance, this spiritual aura was no different from 10 million years ago. However, Luo Fan, who already had his own understanding, quickly discovered the changes compared to 10 million years ago. There were many more feelings that he could understand in this spiritual aura. It was a feeling that belonged to a living being. This feeling of belonging to a living being made him feel closer to this spiritual aura, and they seemed to be more compatible. However, he was very clear that this kind of closeness and compatibility was not a good thing. This was because this closeness and compatibility was because he, as a living being, felt a sense of closeness and compatibility with a living being contained within the spiritual aura, but it did not mean that his relationship with the spiritual aura had become closer and more compatible. In fact, the additional feeling of belonging to a living being in this spiritual aura was an impurity that the spiritual aura should have avoided the most. Once the feeling of the living being contaminated by the spiritual aura was strengthened to a certain extent, this spiritual aura would naturally contaminate the part of the spiritual aura that belonged to the world's will. This would undoubtedly make it much easier for the spiritual aura to grow into a will. However, it would make the quality of the will that he ultimately obtained much worse. It could be imagined that if this change was allowed to continue, when this spiritual aura grew into a will in the future, it would at most be similar to the will of the world that Senior Sister May, the middle-aged cultivator, and the waxen middle-aged man had back then. Just the thought of this situation was enough to make Luo Fan's hair stand on end. It must be known that the light of heaven and earth that Senior Sister May and the others had faced back then could be easily dealt with by him, even if it had just condensed a little bit of spiritual aura. If his light of heaven and earth was able to deal with the level of light of heaven and earth that he had just condensed, it would simply be a mockery of the huge price that he had paid for so many years. Under such circumstances, it was only natural that Luo Fan would feel so fortunate at this moment. The reason why he could wake up at this moment instead of waiting for the light of heaven and earth to reach a point where it could not be salvaged was because the lone cultivator was already gone. In other words, it was precisely because his original continuous cycle had been interrupted at this instant. Fortunately, it seems that if there is a will of the heavens, it is still on my side. At this moment, such a thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind. With this thought, he could not help but look up at the sky. At the very least, it was the sky from his current angle. Chapter 2256. Naturally, Luo Fan would not allow the speculation of the so-called heavenly will to linger in his mind for too long. In fact, he would not even allow it to linger in his mind. After all, for him, who was determined to break through all shackles and transcend everything, admitting the existence of the heavenly would be a blasphemy to all his efforts. Perhaps he would occasionally speculate about the existence of the heavenly will, but he would never really believe that there was a heavenly will that was controlling everything about him. Even if this so-called will of the heavens might really exist at this moment, after erasing the thoughts about the heavenly will, he began to focus his mind on the light of heaven and earth. He began to carefully sense the slightest changes within the light of heaven and earth, searching for the source that made the light of heaven and earth less pure and made the spiritual aura of the light of heaven and earth feel like it belonged to a living being. As he carefully searched, he soon discovered that the location of the existence that he deeply hated was none other than the negative emotional space-time that was enveloped by the light of heaven and earth. Even though he had stopped causing the many unaffiliated cultivators to produce negative emotions, the emotional space-time was still continuously producing various effects that were transmitted into the light of heaven and earth. At this moment, Luo Fan finally saw the changes that the light of heaven and earth was producing under the influence of the negative emotional space-time. A portion of the light of heaven and earth was constantly being stained gray and was quickly expelled by the light of heaven and earth. In his senses, the feeling of a living being appeared from the light of heaven and earth that was being stained gray, but quickly recovered. It then spread to the entire light of heaven and earth, and then to the spiritual aura of the light of heaven and earth. The reason why there was such a change was because the light of heaven and earth naturally contained a bit of the aura of the light of heaven and earth during the change. The remnant of the light of heaven and earth was because the power of the light of heaven and earth was not completely expelled after it spread out. What was the power of the light of heaven and earth? Although the light of heaven and earth was formed by the combination of the emotions of countless living beings and the power of creation, it was still formed after all sorts of mysterious and wonderful changes. However, its foundation was ultimately the various emotions of countless living beings. Even after countless changes, countless cover-ups, and countless distortions, this essence still remained the same. Under such circumstances, the essence of the power that seeped out from the emotional space-time and even affected the light of heaven and earth naturally belonged to emotions. Such emotions were what the light of heaven and earth lacked the most at the moment. Perhaps that was not the final key to the evolution of the spiritual aura within the light of heaven and earth, but it was definitely an existence that could only be possessed after the spiritual aura had completely transformed into the will of the world. Under such circumstances, it was imaginable how much the spiritual aura of the light of heaven and earth desired the emotional essence contained in the power that seeped out of the emotional space-time. For this spiritual aura that had yet to find any direction, breakthrough, or metamorphosis, how could it not regard this emotion that could only be born after its metamorphosis as the key to its metamorphosis? Therefore, after the power of the emotional space-time seeped into the light of heaven and earth, the light of heaven and earth completely crushed and expelled the other powers. However, it naturally devoured the various emotions contained within and integrated them into the spiritual aura of the light of heaven and earth. In this way, as time passed and the number of times the power was contaminated increased, the amount of emotions within the emotional space-time that was fused with the spiritual aura naturally increased. Fortunately, the spiritual aura's essence was extremely high, and it was completely condensed according to the state of the will of the world. Compared to the will of the living beings, it was many times stronger. In the end, the emotions that seeped out of the countless emotional space-time could not produce an immediate effect on the contamination of the spiritual aura. It could not really make the spiritual aura directly fall from the original state of the will of the world to the level of the will of ordinary living beings. Even after tens of millions of years, it only made the spiritual aura feel like a living being. As for whether the emotion itself was negative or positive, it was not reflected in the spiritual aura. After all, positive and negative were concepts at the level of living beings. Such concepts were meaningless to the will of the world, unless the positive or negative emotion could be upgraded to the level of the will of the world. However, it was obvious that the positive or negative emotions contained in the emotional space-time had not been upgraded to the level of the will of the world. That was why the current situation had occurred. After discovering the source of the change, Luo Fan had already decided what to do. I can only destroy it. He sighed to himself and looked at the emotional space-time lying in the depths of the light of heaven and earth with some pity. The power of the emotional space-time was quite terrifying. It was almost fatal to all the rogue cultivators and even all the disciples of the Tao Master on the fourth level of the Tao Master's path. If they were thrown into it, it could be said that it was equivalent to falling into oblivion forever. He could even predict that the negative emotional space-time would inevitably have a strong effect on the fifth or sixth level and would be of great help to him. Once the emotional space-time was sublimated and transformed into the emotional universe, its power might be even more amazing. In the end, it would be able to work on stronger existences and even bring great benefits to his cultivation. It would allow him to comprehend more of the mysteries of the universe and even use this change to understand some of the mysteries of the chaotic state. However, all of this had to be based on the emotional space-time not affecting his own safety. If this emotional space-time could affect his safety and even affect his cultivation and his way of cultivation, then no matter how precious it was and how beneficial it was to him, he would never keep it by his side. To him, the light of heaven and earth was not just a divine ability or a method, but a way to comprehend the will of heaven and earth. It was a way to improve his willpower, to improve his cultivation path, and to improve his understanding of the world of laws. Under such circumstances, if the light of heaven and earth was affected, it meant that everything about him was affected, which was naturally unacceptable to him. Therefore, it was almost inevitable for him to destroy the emotional space-time. After making the decision, Luo Fan's heart moved slightly, and the light of heaven and earth began to change. Its original state of constantly releasing light in all directions and even turning it into an extremely dazzling sun that covered everything began to change rapidly. All the light began to converge, and the originally extremely dazzling appearance began to fade rapidly. Everything that was covered by the dazzling light, including Luo Fan, who was holding the light, and the stone formed by the emotional space-time that existed within the light, was also revealed during this process. On the other hand, within the light, the world's light that was attached to the emotional space-time began to undergo all sorts of indescribable changes. Countless worlds, and space-times were formed out of thin air and began to collide with the emotional space-time, causing it to constantly tremble. When these worlds, and space-time first appeared, they could not have much of an impact on the emotional space-time. Even if they collided with it and caused it to tremble continuously, it only stopped trembling. The emotional space-time was still the same as before. However, as time passed, as the number of worlds, and space-time derived from the light of heaven and earth increased, and as the number of collisions increased, the emotional space-time was affected more and more. After millions of times, the outer layer of the emotional space-time began to disintegrate bit by bit in every collision between heaven and earth, world, and space-time, and its internal structure became more and more chaotic in the process. It was as if the power of those worlds, and space-time could penetrate into the emotional space-time. In the face of this situation, After tens of millions of years of evolution, the emotional space-time, which was completely different from what it used to be and was only one last transformation away from the emotional universe, also produced various mysterious and complicated changes. It gave birth to all kinds of incredible power, unimaginable light and shadow, and even condensed into countless creatures that were constantly emerging from the emotional space-time from all directions. They rushed to the boundary of the emotional space-time and rushed into the worlds, and space-time that collided with the emotional space-time to strangle everything, destroy everything, and resist everything. The change of the light of heaven and earth was very simple. Under the will of Luo Fan, the light of heaven and earth manipulated the light of heaven and earth with its aura of spirituality that was close to the will of heaven and earth to specifically evolve the emotional space-time. It produced a world, and a space-time that completely targeted the emotional space-time to collide with the emotional space-time and to strangle the emotional space-time in the most natural and most targeted way. This change was also the fundamental difference between Luo Fan's light of heaven and earth and that of Senior Sister Mei and other fifth-level Dao Master disciples and Ro cultivators. The will of the light of heaven and earth was itself the will of heaven and earth. Under the control of this will, the light of heaven and earth should be able to evolve according to all situations and finally suppress and destroy everything. Whether it was the means of the fifth-level Dao Master or the means of a higher level, the light of heaven and earth would definitely have a way to deal with everything. After all, there are still some effects. Feeling the various changes inside the light of heaven and earth, Luo Fan secretly sighed. The emotional space-time had been contaminated by the spiritual aura of the light of heaven and earth for tens of millions of years. And after all, it still affected the light of heaven and earth a lot. If the light of heaven and earth faced the emotional space-time in the past, it would have taken 10 times less time to evolve its attack to the current stage. In that case, it would have been difficult for the emotional space-time to react and resist the various targeted means that the light of heaven and earth had evolved. Perhaps the light of heaven and earth had already completely destroyed the emotional space-time. However, fortunately, he discovered early, in this natural evolution, the spiritual aura of the light of heaven and earth instinctively discovered the various impurities that affected its improvement, slowed down its growth, and even destroyed the evolution of its power. Finally, in the process of constantly displaying its power and evolving means, it took the initiative to drive out the emotions of the living beings that had been contaminated by the emotional space-time for tens of millions of years. This was like an ordinary person thinking that wearing a heavy armor as heavy as a tank on the battlefield would be of great help to his killing and escape. He even thought that he could become a tank because of this and be invincible. However, once he was on the battlefield, he would realize that his arrogance was completely wrong. This kind of armor not only hindered him from killing, but it also hindered him from escaping. At that time, he would take off the heavy, tank-like armor and naturally take the initiative to return to a relaxed state. The light of heaven and earth was like that ordinary person. Before it started fighting with the emotional space-time, it thought that the emotions that had been contaminated by the emotional space-time would be of great benefit to its sublimation, metamorphosis, and evolution. Therefore, it was eager to pull all the emotions from the emotional space-time over and fuse them into itself. However, when it really faced the emotional space-time and used its strongest means to attack the emotional space-time, it realized that these emotions were a huge burden to it. The more these emotions there were, the weaker its strength would be. With such willpower, it would naturally get rid of these emotions instinctively. As for the difficulty of getting rid of these emotions, it was needless to say. As the will of a living being, it was naturally difficult to get rid of the emotions in the spiritual aura that was close to the will of the world for Luo Fan. However, for the spiritual aura, getting rid of these emotions was as obvious as taking off one's clothes. How difficult was it at all? After all, the spiritual aura was an existence that could target all the powerhouses from the 5th level. How difficult was it to derive some means to get rid of these emotions? Chapter 2257. Luo Fan was not surprised by the light of Universe's spiritual aura's choice. After all, before encountering an unsolvable problem, any consciousness would naturally be confident in its own judgment. It was the same for this spiritual aura. Before it was completely convinced that all these emotions would only have negative effects on its performance, it naturally wouldn't overturn its original conclusion so easily. However, it was obvious that this would happen sooner or later. The emotions that came from emotional space-time were indeed a burden and poison to the spiritual aura. As long as it continued to fight against the emotional space-time, it would discover this sooner or later. Therefore, it was only temporarily reluctant to get rid of them. As time passed and the battle progressed, there would come a day when it would truly get rid of all the influence of the emotions at this moment. In his world group, the consciousness of a rogue cultivator suddenly woke up due to some unknown reason and broke free from the influence of the reincarnation power. At this moment, the cultivation realm of the cultivator that he had reincarnated into began to rise rapidly, and his strength swelled at a crazy rate. In the blink of an eye, he had risen from the false sage stage to the tribulation stage powerhouse. Following this, he changed again and again. Not long after, he had risen from the early tribulation stage to the 4th tribulation stage powerhouse. At this stage, the world he was in was already a shackle for the rogue cultivator. In that instant, the power in his body surged, and the violent power directly broke through the world. Boundless power wreaked havoc in all directions, affecting other worlds, and other space-time. All of a sudden, the entire world cluster seemed to have fallen into extreme chaos. Even the vortex in the outside world seemed to be shaken in the process, vaguely creating subtle chaos. Luo Fan immediately sensed something. With a thought, his perception directly descended on that world through the connection of the world group and enveloped that rogue cultivator. At this moment, the rogue cultivator had completely recovered his memory and strength, and instantly discovered Luo Fan's perception. At this moment, he was so angry that he wanted to go crazy. His incomparably ferocious power increased crazily, and an incomparably terrifying impact swept out in all directions from where he was. It crazily impacted the endless void around him, the endless heaven and earth, the endless world, the endless space-time and the void. How dare you play with my memory and my will? Go to hell. An incomparably strong will instantly burst out from his body. It was like a raging flame, burning and contaminating everything. What made you wake up? Luo Fan murmured. With a thought, the power of the world group instantly gathered around the rogue cultivator, completely imprisoning him inside and out. The power of Luo Fan's world group had been enhanced by many rogue cultivators, countless disciples of Tao Masters, and even the middle-aged rogue cultivator from the 5th level of the Tao Master's path. At this moment, the power stimulated an effect that was similar to the barrier between the levels and directly confined the various waves, thoughts, power, and power released by the rogue cultivator. Although the rogue cultivator could still sense everything within this power, he felt as if he had turned into an ordinary mortal and was facing a supreme god. He could not even move his body, let alone use his power and magic power. Don't even think about knowing what made me wake up. A powerful will suddenly burst out from the rogue cultivator's body. At this moment, this rogue cultivator actually brazenly detonated his own mind, wanting to completely erase everything he knew, so that Luo Fan would no longer be able to obtain any information from him. It was a pity that everything inside was under Luo Fan's control. Even time and opportunity couldn't escape his control at this moment. The fact that he did not detonate himself before being controlled meant that he no longer had any chance to detonate himself. At this moment, the power of Luo Fan's world group directly seeped into the rogue cultivator's body and directly gathered all the power, and willpower in his body. In the blink of an eye, he felt that his will and memories, which had already been ignited, had instantly stagnated. His memories began to unfold like a scroll, and all the secrets began to emerge in the process. Nothing was left out, and they were all read by the terrifying existence in front of him. There's a power similar to emotions that directly swept away all the fog and woke him up. After investigating the source, Luo Fan finally found the ultimate source. So it's that. At this moment, Luo Fan understood what was going on. It turned out that it was the emotional space-time. As for the method it used, it was very simple. It was through the indescribable, mysterious connection that existed between the emotional space-time and the living being that it transmitted its own power to the will of the living being. With the power of emotions, it cleared away the fog that had been laid on the mind of the reincarnation of heaven and earth. In the end, the rogue cultivator directly regained his consciousness, and in the process, he took back all the power that had been imprisoned by Luo Fan. I didn't expect it to be like this. Luo Fan frowned at this moment. The rogue cultivator regained his freedom, and it was not a problem for him to take back his power. After all, with his means, he could suppress the rogue cultivator again in a minute, and even put him back into the reincarnation, so that he could once again provide power for the evolution of his heaven and earth, world, and space-time. However, this was only limited to a few people, and even limited to the rogue cultivator himself. If this goal was extended to every individual cultivator, even every disciple of a Tao master, and even a middle-aged individual cultivator who came from the 5th level of the Tao master's path could obtain this kind of help to retrieve their memories and strength, they would be able to do so. That would be a rather big problem for him. Not to mention, his world group would definitely be seriously damaged, and a large part of his energy would be needed to repair it. His support for the light of heaven and earth would probably weaken. In this way, the resistance of the emotional space-time towards the light of heaven and earth would probably increase to an unimaginable level. It might even reverse the situation and destroy his light of heaven and earth. Just as he was thinking about this, there was a sudden roar from all over the world group. Waves of powerful aura broke through the shackles of heaven and earth, world, and space-time, and directly descended into the void between the world group, destroying the heaven and earth, world, and space-time where they were. Kill! The roar spread throughout the world group in an instant. At the same time, outside Luo Fan's world group, many space-times that were directly or indirectly stuck to his world group and were completely enveloped by the will world above the world group began to change at this moment. It was as if they had suddenly awakened from their slumber and began to resist the will world that covered them. They began to resist the oneness that connected them to Luo Fan's world group. Obviously, this was because the masters of the world group had gained autonomy and began to mobilize all their power to resist Luo Fan's power. The number of rogue cultivators kept increasing. In the beginning, there were only a few hundred of them, but in the blink of an eye, there were tens of thousands. In the blink of an eye, there were hundreds of thousands of them. Fortunately, it's not all the cultivators, just these rogue cultivators who came later. After sensing for a while, Luo Fan let out a sigh of relief. At the same time, he had an inexplicable guess. These cultivators who were constantly receiving the power of the emotional space-time and awakening were not all the cultivators who were thrown into his world group to help the world group evolve. Instead, they were the rogue cultivators who were thrown into the world group after the emotional space-time was formed. In other words, they were the rogue cultivators who were thrown into the world group in the past tens of millions of years. With this, he could not help but make some guesses about how they could obtain the power of the emotional space-time. It was probably because they had already established a connection with the emotional space-time, which allowed them to obtain power from the emotional space-time and help them recover. In other words, it was because the emotional space-time was born and grew that it absorbed a large amount of positive or negative emotions from them, causing them to unknowingly establish an indescribable, mysterious connection with the emotional space-time. This allowed the emotional space-time to pour its own power into their bodies and help them clear the fog left in their consciousness by the world group. After thinking of this, his expression relaxed a little. After knowing the source, he already had many ideas to cut off this connection. With a slight thought, he continuously transmitted his thoughts into the light of heaven and earth. As his thoughts were transmitted, the light of heaven and earth began to surge naturally. Layers of strange barriers instantly formed on the surface of the light of heaven and earth. They constantly rotated and changed. The frequency of the changes was so fast that it had even surpassed Luo Fan's perception. Even if it was him, he could only see that the barrier was constantly rotating, constantly changing in all kinds of special forms that were either common or rare. However, he could not distinguish how many changes there were on the barrier in an instant. This performance allowed Luo Fan to instantly calculate how many changes there were on the barrier in an instant. With his ability to distinguish, it would take at least hundreds of trillions of changes for him to not be able to distinguish them. In other words, the countless layers of the barrier that enveloped the light of heaven and earth were going through hundreds of trillions of changes in an instant. During these changes, the barrier's impact on the connection that he wanted to intercept had not yet appeared. However, the effect it had on the light of heaven and earth itself was already evident. As the barrier's changes appeared, the spiritual aura of the light of heaven and earth that belonged to a living being began to disappear at an unimaginable speed. Judging from the speed at which it was disappearing, it was at least 10 times faster than before. It was obvious that the spiritual aura finally understood more clearly during this process of change. The emotions of this living being were a huge burden to it. Faced with this unexpected gain, Luo Fan could not help but shake his head and smile. At that moment, he no longer cared about the light of heaven and earth. With a sweep of his hand, all the itinerant cultivators who had regained their consciousness and strength were enveloped by the power of the world cluster. All of their strength, power, and even their thoughts were completely frozen. The difference in strength brought about by a realm higher was like the difference between heaven and earth. Luo Fan's current realm was more than just one realm higher than the itinerant cultivators. Under such circumstances, unless all the worlds, and space-time in his world cluster were destroyed, he would not be able to unleash his strength. Otherwise, no matter how many cultivators there were, it was just a matter of whether he wanted to deal with them or not, and how he wanted to deal with them. After the cultivators were completely frozen, he did not hesitate to use the power of the world cluster to pull the worlds, and space-time that had been destroyed by the itinerant cultivators out of the river of time. He directly appeared in the world cluster and mended the world cluster, making it complete again. For Luo Fan, this change was equivalent to making up for what he lacked. It was nothing much. However, for the itinerant cultivators, it was an indescribable sense of despair. They had paid a huge price and even put themselves in, but the impact they had caused had disappeared in the blink of an eye. The damage they had caused had been restored in an instant. To them, this situation was simply a blatant mockery. It was a slap in the face without holding back. It went without saying how much despair they felt and how unbearable it was. The emotions of despair continued to be transmitted to the emotional space-time through the mysterious connection. It kept increasing the power of the emotional space-time, causing the emotional space-time to resist the light of heaven and earth even more strongly. At that moment, the pressure on the light of heaven and earth became even more terrifying. However, this was not entirely a bad thing for the light of heaven and earth. It was not only because the increased pressure made it more aware of the negative emotions that tainted its body, but more importantly, these negative emotions used the connection channel between the cultivators and the emotional space-time in the process of being transmitted into the emotional space-time.